Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Stannis' army arrived by the early hours of the next morning, but significantly after the rest of Robb's Northern and Riverlands host had commanded the base of Castle Black and a portion of Molestown that they began rebuilding. Hermione stood next to Robb from the flanking gate tower catwalk, overlooking the large northern host. As they began to wake, on Robb's other side stood Jon, with several other members of the Night's Watch who survived the wilding battle nearby. Sam, Gren, and even a sour, Alliser Thorne. Lord Bolton stood next to Hermione, his pale eyes surveying the marching Baratheon army with a grim twist to his mouth. Lyra Mormont leaned against the gate tower wall, peering intently with her dark eyes at the host and idly tapping one of the flats of her blades against clothed arm in boredom. There was an almost visible ripple through the Baratheon host, as they realized that they, who were supposed to reinforce a relieved Night's Watch, were not the first relief host to arrive, with a tiny pause in their march. They're confused, thought Hermione, satisfaction pooling low in her belly. Good. That'll make it easier to deal with them if they're off-kilter. Should we send out a welcoming party? Asked Hermione quietly, turning a bit to look at Robb and Jon. Thorne, who overheard her, scowled. They can march themselves in without being led like a fucking child. Lord Bolton, interrupted Robb, speaking over Thorne, send a message to my uncle and Lord Umber. I think they would be excellent choices in greeting Lord Baratheon. Not King, continued Thorne snidely. Lyra gave a derisive snort in response, and no one else spoke to the man. Bolton did not nod in agreement, but quickly darted his eyes at Hermione and then at Thorne. Hermione, understanding what he meant, jerked her head to the side. Robb watched their interaction carefully, but made no move to interrupt the two, even as Thorne and a few other members of the Night's Watch started grumbling. What's that about? Whispered Jon to his brother as soon as Bolton strode away. Robb leaned against the barrier, with both his elbows resting on the wooden rail. He kept his eyes forward on the marching host as he spoke. Hermione's a witch, right? Yes. Well, one of the things her magic is able to do is provide us with faster communication, explained Robb in a very low voice, ensuring that Jon had to strain to hear him. We've been using enchanted mirrors for instant communication between high-ranking members of my council. Jon's face was a picture of shock. Instant communication. Robb nodded once. So Lord Bolton was asking Hermione if she wanted her abilities to be well known at the moment. No one outside of the Northern and Riverlands lords really know about Hermione's abilities. And even so, I doubt she's shown us all she can do. By the look of things, she wants to keep her abilities as quiet as possible, right now. Something calculated shifted behind Jon's gray eyes. You don't mind your men taking orders from her? Robb rose from the rail and shrugged. She's proven fairly capable of leading my men when I wasn't around for the past several moons. And besides, why shouldn't they when I've demonstrated I trust her? I would say more than trust, muttered Jon, but Robb refused to reply further. When he didn't speak, Jon turned to Thorne. Should we get the dining hall ready for Lord Baratheon and his men? Thorne's mouth turned into a ferocious scowl, and he barked, What am I, your fucking septa? Get to it, Lord Snow, you don't need my permission. That's Commander Snow, inputted Sam, quietly, as Commander Mormont passed the title to him when he died. That wasn't a vote that I agreed to, responded Thorne, spitting on the ground and then turning, walking away at a brisk pace. Jon sighed. Thank you, Sam. Don't worry about him, Jon, spoke up Gren. He's just upset. He was passed over as commander. That's exactly what I'm worried about, muttered Jon. And we really don't need anyone else being upset. We need to stand together. Well, let's see what Lord Baratheon wants, said Robb, hoping to infuse as much positivity into his voice as possible. The skeptical side-eye that he received from his half-brother told him he wasn't very successful, but still, Jon kept quiet. Soon, he led Robb and Lyra to the dining hall, one of the larger spaces inside Castle Black that was also one of the warmest, with a large hearth at the end of the long, rectangular room located in the larger of the towers. Already, the hall was filled with a good majority of Robb's inner council. Lord Bracken, Lord Karstark, Lord Bolton, and Hermione stood off to one side, conversing in low tones. Peppered around the lords were Robb's guard. Ed sat near his father, but kept a wary set of eyes on Hermione, no doubt in case she decided to apparate away, again, along with Lucas Blackwood, Patrek Mallister, and the small Jon Umber. Wendell Manderly and Darren Hornwood fell into step behind Robb as he entered the room, having been waiting at the door for him, Lyra was more than enough to guard him when Hermione was around and within Castle Black. Brienne and Jaime Lannister were near the cluster of Robb's men, both seated with their backs to the wall so they could watch those entering the room. The Lannister was even drinking ale of some sort from a mug, an incredibly smug expression on his face, while Brienne scowled deeply at him, her lips moving but her voice too low for anyone to make out what she was saying. Opposite them stood Maester Aemon, the wizened, hunched-over keeper of lore at Castle Black. He was leaning heavily against a black brother, who carefully helped him into a seat by a long table. His unseeing eyes unnervingly managed to locate and focus on Jaime Lannister, whose smug smirk quickly dropped off his face with a long gulp of his drink as soon as he realized the man was looking at him. Sam Tarly settled next to the maester as his apprentice, with Jon's friends Gren, Ed Tollett nearby. Alliser Thorne, limping and sporting a purple bruise to the corner of his face, went to another group of brothers and sat heavily on the accompanying long bench. "Your Grace," greeted Bolton softly. "As requested, the Blackfish and Lord Umber have gone to parley with Lord Baratheon and will bring him here." "Thank you, Bolton," replied Robb, moving to stand next to Hermione, just as the others shifted to make space for their king by providing a gap by her. He placed a hand low on her back and tilted his face down to speak to her. "Have you heard anything about Baratheon and his movements since I was gone? We didn't get an opportunity to speak of him earlier."
Hermione's mouth turned down in a frown. Nothing clear. Some odd information about people being burned in the Stormlands. But that's about it. He was very quiet after Blackwater Bay. Disappeared nearly off everyone's radar. To be fair, none of us were really focused on him when you were gone.
"Radar?" wondered Robb, but he shook his head. "Let's be careful with what we say around him, then." Hermione nodded her agreement. They stood in silence, waiting for Stannis Baratheon to arrive. And when he did so, Hermione took the opportunity to size him up. The man was tall, but lean. He moved confidently, but his stepping into the room wasn't brash or bold, but rather that of a man supremely confident in himself, and his demeanor reflected that. His armor was unadorned, simplistic, and well-kept, but with dings and dents here and there, indicating he had seen battle. Both the Blackfish and the elder Umber quickly peeled off from him to stand with Robb's group. The matching sour look on their faces did not bode well for this conversation, and Hermione quickly turned her attention to the slightly shorter man at Baratheon's side. He had gray hair and a pinched brow, his hair shorn close to his scalp. He had a thick but a neatly trimmed beard that darkened in color around his nose and tops of his cheeks. He was dressed warmly in nearly all black and looked more like one of the Night's Watch than the others. Opposite him stood a tall, willowy woman with dark, blood-red hair in loose waves. She had odd red eyes, a hue that seemed to be lit with an inner fire. Her dress was rather provocative, with a dip by her cleavage, and she appeared underdressed for the weather. Hermione squinted at her, and her magic, still buzzing under her skin from whatever happened when she was at the top of the wall, tingled, and she stiffened. Unlike the strange man at Harrenhal when she helped take back the old fortress, who felt like death and decay, this woman felt like fiend fire and the Cruciatus licking and biting into Hermione's skin. At the same time, the woman's eyes moved over to her and stopped. The two stared at each other for a long, long moment, just as Stannis Baratheon surveyed those in the room. When he spoke, Hermione tore her eyes from the woman in red to focus on him. "You're the commander." Jon nodded slowly. "I am." "Do you know who I am?" Jon nodded again. "You're Lord Stannis Baratheon." "This is Stannis Baratheon, the one true king of the Seven Kingdoms," interrupted the man at his side, causing everyone to look at him. "You should address your king with more care, Lord Commander." The tenseness in the room skyrocketed, and some of the Northerners grumbled. "The Night's Watch does not meddle in the affairs of the realm," replied Jon, slowly, eyes slightly narrowed when he spoke. His voice had significantly cooled. "Oh?" said Stannis, turning his eyes to where Robb stood with Hermione, surrounded by his men. "And yet I see a pretender king. Or have so many northern houses pledged to the Night's Watch recently?" "Who are you calling a pretender king?" rumbled Umber, his voice low and deep as he took a threatening step forward. "As my brother's heir, I am next in line for the throne," interjected Stannis smoothly, his face unchanging as he spoke. "Therefore, I am king of the Seven Kingdoms. That includes the North. There was a deep scowl on Lyra's face when she spoke. We know no king, but the king in the North, whose name is Stark. I beg your pardon. Stannis' voice was sharp but quiet, like a deadly blade sliding between ribs. The dining room they were in, already cold from the onslaught of winter, dropped in temperature further. King Stannis is more than just a protector of the Seven Realms, came the soft, sibilant tones of the woman in red as she stepped out from just behind Stannis to make everyone focus on her. She was overtly sexual with the swing of her hips, the low, full tone of her voice, and Hermione immediately distrusted her. He is Azor Ahai, the prince who was promised. He will bring peace. He will bring protection. He will end all wars. All wars. Hermione couldn't help it. She snorted, and the sound echoed in the room. Robb's hand, low on her back, spazzed a bit as all eyes swung her way. You do not believe the prophecy, the woman said, her red eyes focused unerringly on Hermione. The witch shook her head. Oh, I believe that you believe in the prophecy. But that's how prophecy works. It's highly subjective, and often they come true because people heard it and believe it. It's self-fulfilling. She tossed her head back, her hair bouncing, and tilted her chin up as she peered imperiously down at the woman. Besides, you haven't even said the prophecy, just that you think Lord Baratheon. King Stannis, muttered the whiskered man. Is this person, finished Hermione, ignoring the interruption. You speak like you know of prophecy. Hermione's mouth flattened into a tight line, and an echo rang through her mind. Harry's 16-year-old self and voice cracking as he told her and Ron, neither can live while the other survives, for either must die at the hand of the other. I do, she said instead. Robb's hand slid from her low back, higher up, and then pressed between her shoulder blades. Hermione gave an inaudible sigh and leaned back, letting his hand ground her. The red woman's eyes glittered in the flickering candlelight. And so do I, she said quietly. There was a moment of breathlessness between the two, and then she turned from Hermione back to Stannis. Let us rest the topic for now. Stannis' eyes were shrewd as he glanced between the two women, but he nodded and turned back to Jon. I believe you have some prisoners from the attack. About 24, replied Jon, glancing at Sam, who deftly stepped forward with a parchment filled with his smooth cursive and numbers, and another 15 that are injured. How many dead? Jon frowned. Wildlings? Nearly 100. Out of our brothers? Sadness passed over his face as he remembered fallen friends. Hermione knew one of those, Pape, had been shot by the red-headed woman she had been so obsessed with finding, the magic of the wall and the area urging her to go after the wildling with such abandon. Almost all. We're down to no more than 20 active men without major injury. And where is this king beyond the wall, as he calls himself? Asked the whiskered man. Gren, nearby, shrugged. Well, it's in his name, isn't it? Beyond the wall. The whiskered man ground his molars. How many men does he have? Still? Jon shrugged. Perhaps thousands. 100,000. It's hard to tell from the top of the wall. But they aren't camped that far away. I'm sure they'll try again shortly. So many? How is that possible? The man continued, his voice growing with ire and incredulity. How could there be that many? I thought they were just random tribes and small villages. Mance Rayder has been gathering them for some time now, interjected Gren, who folded his arms and jutted his square jaw out in stubbornness. We've been telling you lot that. If there is that many, broke in Stannis, his collected voice carrying above the growing din an argument between Gren and his man, then I'll have the thousands of his men in chains by nightfall, but have nowhere to put them, have nothing to feed them. So, kill 'em, grumbled Thorne from his seat. That's what wildlings are good for, being dead. Jon scowled deeply and sent the older man a dark look. If you plan to attack Mance's men, if you had seen the things that I've seen, you would burn any of your dead before nightfall. Jon's gaze shifted from Thorne, who met his glare, to everyone else in the room. All of them. There was an uneasy silence. Hermione herself frowned and thought back to the reactions that the lords had when they saw her dark arts textbook of the Inferi and what they called them, and the history behind such creatures. Were these White Walkers and Whites the reason why Maiji's brother Jor was dead? They still didn't know what happened at the Great Ranging. The Night's Watch brothers had been cagey and quiet about it, and the downtime since their arrival was spent either tending to injuries or burning the dead, on Jon's insistence. She turned partially to Robb and tugged on his sleeve. He glanced at her as she leaned up on her toes and whispered in his ear, "We need to know more about the Great Ranging that happened. Something isn't being said." Robb drew back far enough to peer at Hermione, his eyes scanning her face and taking in her serious countenance. He nodded once. If there is no space to house these prisoners, or feed them, then I suggest we treat them all the same, including those prisoners here at Castle Black. The woman in red was speaking. Let us offer them to Reller. Who now? Muttered Patrek Mollister from behind Robb. Her red eyes turned to him as if she had heard him clear across the room. The Lord of Light is wondrous and kind, brother. He is one locked in battle with the great other. From the other's domain of ice and terror, will a great battle commence with only Azor Ahai, the prince who was promised, able to defeat such an evil? The great other, thought Hermione, sharing a quick glance with Lord Karstark as he shifted to move up to her left. The paleness of his face and his own worried eyes echoed her feelings on the matter. There was some connection between the religion of the Red Woman and what lurked beyond the wall.
You think Lord Baratheon is this of Azor Ahai? Asked Robb, the foreign title sounding strange on his tongue as he rolled it around the two words.
I do not think, replied the woman. I know. And what does it mean to offer people to richer? Asked Hermione carefully, pitching her voice into a cautious tone. They will burn, came the woman's swift reply, a strange, fanatical light to her eyes as she spread her arms and her sleeves billowed behind her, although not pure and innocent. Ratter will take their sacrifice, for the night is dark and full of terrors, and the Lord of the Light will lead us from the darkness. A few of the Baratheon guards Stannis brought with him, hovering awkwardly near the door at the back of the hall, murmured in reverence, "The night is dark and full of terrors," causing the nearest Night's Watch brothers to scuttle back in alarm, disgust on their faces. "You want to burn him?" blurted out a shocked Emil Lannister, slowly rising from his place at the table. Brienne copied him, her eyes wary and her hand already resting on the hilt of her sword. Stannis shifted, his entire body turning to face Jaime, disgust taking over his stone-cold face as his eyes swept the man from head to toe. He turned back to Robb and demanded, "I will have the Kingslayer. He will pay for his crimes, and justice will be served." Jaime Lannister will not be going anywhere, broke in Hermione, hotly as she took a few steps forward. Her eyes flashed, and she felt her hands tremble at her side as her magic roared up, a loud pounding in her ears. He is paying penance for his crimes against House Stark, and as such, he will not be extradited to the Stormlands for execution. Stannis' upper lip curled slightly. He kept his eyes on Hermione, but addressed Robb. "You allow this woman to speak for you?" Nonchalantly, Robb shifted into a relaxed pose, although he kept a hand casually resting on the hilt of the sword of Gryffindor. "Why shouldn't I? She's doing such fine work." There were chortles around the Northerner and Riverlanders, signaling their solidarity around their king and Hermione. Even if one agreed with Stannis, they weren't about to single themselves out by publicly disagreeing with their king. Feeling a bit more secure, Jaime cleared his throat. "I don't like repeating myself, Lord Baratheon. You would burn these people. Their sacrifice would appease Reller," the woman explained, although Hermione was sure her disbelief was being made obvious with her skeptical eyebrow raise. "They will ascend to the Hall of Light to sit beside the Lord of all things good." "Poppycock," scoffed Karstark under his breath, causing Hermione's lips to twitch into a small smile. She then turned, sharing a quick look with Robb that conveyed her thoughts on the matter. There was something special in the way he seemed to read her, able to understand exactly what she was trying to say without words because he gave her a small smile in return and decisive nod. His steps were solid as he stepped up to match pace alongside Hermione, allowing them to present a united front for the room. "There will be no burnings here." "Agreed," added Jon quickly, who had been quietly watching. "I will not give over our prisoners to Reller or anyone else for death. There's been too much of that lately, with winter coming, and everything else along with it. We must stand together as one." The woman's red eyes darkened, glittering as they coolly turned from the king in the north, the woman standing beside him, and then to the Black Brothers of the Night's Watch, a few who were slowly standing to convey their support to their commander. "Very well," she finally said. "I see that none of you are believers of Rucha yet, but you will be, soon." Her ruby-colored eyes landed on Jon, and her blood-red lips turned down in a frown. "And you will learn this most of all, Commander. You who knows that the night is dark and full of terrors. You who knows what keeps the savage dark at bay. You have seen the Great Other and his ilk. You know, and this will doom you." The woman swept the sleeves of her dress in an arc and strode out of the room, leaving Stannis Baratheon and his man in guard. After a few long moments of terse silence, where everyone looked at the other, Stannis sighed. I will take several companies of my men to meet Mance Rayder and accept his surrender. He cannot win against my men, and even with our combined forces, it would be a slaughter."
"You would see reason," agreed Jon solemnly. "I was the man's prisoner once. He could have tortured me or have me killed, but he didn't."
Stannis nodded. "Will the gate be open for us?" Jon paused, debating a moment, but then nodded shortly. "There is a giant that needs to be removed from the Blackgate tunnel, but once your men have helped clear it, you may pass through unimpeded." There was nothing left to say after that. Stannis, either realizing the wisdom that insisting he was king of the Seven Realms, while two of those were an open and antagonist, rebellion was not a good idea, or that he had a greater purpose, decided that their conversation was done. He turned and left the room without speaking. The whiskered man sighed, his shoulders slumping, but he then straightened and followed with a careful nod at both Jon and then Robb. Once the Baratheon guards were gone, with the small Jon Umber and Patrick Mallister swiftly following to ensure they left, did the room seem to sigh in relief as one. "She's a witch, isn't she?" finally asked Robb carefully, glancing at Hermione. Hermione frowned. "Of a sort, I think. My magic... Well, they definitely recognized each other, but it was like oil and water. Two different kinds. But if she comes from a place of magic like you..." "She's from Ashai. Who knows what that place is like?" interrupted Hermione, eyes hard as Robb frowned. "Right? She's a red priestess. They come only from Ashai. That's not like my home, Robb, not at all." "There's a prophecy, though." The redhead continued slowly, glancing at Jon, who tilted his head in response. "What she said about you." "Rubbish," protested Hermione. "You can't trust divination at all. It's woolly." Jon was nodding along, even as behind him, Robb could hear Jaime Lannister ask, "What does that even mean, woolly? How can something be made of sheep's fur?" "I don't think we have anything to worry about, Robb," placated Jon, with a tight smile on his face, one that matched the tight lines that stretched at the corner of his eyes. Robb's face pinched in worry, and he felt his mouth turn down as his eyes skipped over his half-brother's face. Gods, we're only 21 and 20 at most, and Jon already has wrinkles. Has being commander been so difficult on him? Jon strode away, leaving Robb behind with his guard, as well as his advisors. His great-uncle spoke up. "Is that feckin' idiot really gonna go beyond the wall to fight Mance Rayder? Doesn't he know what he's gonna face?" Robb sighed and resisted the urge to run his hand over his jaw. Southerners barely acknowledge the North exists. "Uncle, it's unlikely they'd believe any of our tales." He turned his steely blue eyes on some of the remaining Night's Watch brothers as they milled around the Great Hall, slowly filtering out one by one until his eyes rested on Sam Tarly and Maester Aemon. "But I do believe it's time we start getting our facts straight." "Hear, hear," muttered Karstark, and as one, the Northern and Riverlands contingent turned to face the two men still sitting at the table. Sam immediately tensed, eyes growing wide. "Samwell?" Maester Aemon queried, his milky, unseeing eyes turning in his steward's direction, sensing the tension in the younger man's frame. Robb strode over to the far table and loomed over it for a long moment, looking down at Sam, whose eyes grew wider and wider until he resembled an owl. The younger man had paled, the white of his face contrasting sharply with the black of his clothing, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened in the dim candlelight. Then, abruptly, Robb sat down. "Samwell Tarly, correct?" Maester Aemon's unseeing eyes slid over to the new voice, just as Sam squeaked, "Why, yes. Why, your grace?" "Your grace?" echoed Aemon, a quizzical furrow to his brow that quickly smoothed. Robb Stark, is it? The king in the north?" "That it is, Maester Aemon," the young man replied, a small smile on his lips. Hermione wandered over and watched Robb as he projected cheerfulness in his voice, things that never reached the coolness of his eyes. She knew this game. He was emulating portions of Harry, who learned it from a mix of Remus, Sirius, and even the eldest Weasleys in Kingsley after the war. Useful, she had thought at the time, the one time she watched Harry deal with a Wizengamot member in the months following the funerals, just shortly before she ended up in Westeros. Robb had spent much time with Harry in Britain, it seemed.
"What can we do for you, your grace?"
The older man continued, his voice thin and reedy with age, but still polite. It was an interesting juxtaposition to see how the Night's Watch treated Robb versus how they treated Stannis. "Maester Aemon," began Robb, still in that genial tone, "perhaps you and Sam here can answer some questions for us." "We shall do our best," promised the old man, nodding firmly while Sam's eyes continued to dart nervously between the two. There was something on his face that implied he had an inkling of what was coming. Robb's answering grin was a feral thing. His teeth were sharp and pointed, and his eyes blazed in the flickering torchlight, so much so that he looked eerily like gray wind on the prowl. Something in Hermione recognized the otherworldliness in Robb's expression, and her eyes narrowed on him as he leaned forward over the table. Sam leaned back in response, and even Aemon seemed to be struggling to hold back from physically responding to something he couldn't see. "Tell me," began Robb, his voice low and sounding like a dangerous purr. "Tell me exactly what happened during the ranging." Aemon's mouth turned down in a heavy frown, and then he turned partially to Sam. Sweat pooled around the larger man's collar as he audibly gulped, nervously wringing his hands. Well, it started a bit like this way, Your Majesty." And as he spoke, Hermione's eyes grew wide with terror, as did Robb's and those who remained in the Great Hall with them until they were enormous circles. Fury pounded through Robb's body as he stalked down the winding halls and crisscrossing outdoor pathways that connected the various buildings at Castle Black, Grey Wind keeping pace at his heels as he took one hallway or stair after the other in search of his half-brother. Robb! Wait! Your Highness, please! He ignored Hermione's pleas and the calls from his guards and great-uncle. His blood rushed in his ears, leaving him deaf to almost anything as his thoughts swam, some faster than others as his hands clenched at his sides. Commander Mormont was killed in a coup by his own men, thought Robb, flashing back to the pain in Myga's face when she finally learned the truth of her brother's death. The duplicity and disloyalty from the oath-bound brothers made his Stark blood burn, especially given where and when the murder had taken place. Their horn blew 3 times, he thought, and despite the flush his anger gave him, his skin broke out in goose pimples. Once to greet a brother, twice for wildlings, 3 times for a white, the undead walk Westeros, once more. It was a hard truth to swallow. It was one thing hearing Karstark and the others talk about these inferi, as Hermione called them, and seeing the images of a lumbering, slow-moving, emaciated corpses with stringy clumps of hair and hollow cheeks in her books, to knowing Sam Tarly slew an other. A White Walker attempted to kill him after killing others, and Sam stabbed it with an obsidian dagger. Hermione's frown and glazed eyes meant she was processing the information, and a part of Robb wished he could do the same, to figure out the connection between the others and obsidian. But another part, the prevalent part, was recoiling in horror at knowing that old Nan's stories weren't stories, but cautionary tales of truth. Fighting a shiver, he absently wondered, what else did she tell us that is true? And then his thoughts returned to the issue at hand, and his anger roared to the front of his mind, just as he took the last stairs 2 at a time until he stood before a closed wooden door. He vaguely heard his half-brother's muffled voice through it. For a moment he paused. Do I do this? But then, J.R. Mormont's death. The others and whites, the wildling army, burning the dead. A prophecy. The magic of the wall and its effect on Hermione. Mance Rayder. Stannis Baratheon, the priestess from Ashai. Azor Ahai! And Robb's face morphed into a stern countenance, echoing that of his father's. Despite his red hair and blue eyes, he never looked more like Eddard Stark at that moment, when he reached forward and shoved the door open, effectively causing everyone in the room beyond to stop speaking and stare at him. Why didn't you tell me, John? The demand burst from Robb's mouth, half pleading, as he stared at his sibling, who blinked back in shock. He stood with a few members of the Night's Watch, his friends who did not remain in the Great Hall earlier, and some of the senior members who survived the battle. There were invisible battle lines drawn with who stood where in the room, but the Black brothers turned as one and were a collective force when they regarded the young king. Tell you what, asked John. But there was a hint of wariness in his tone as the latest commandant squared his shoulders against whatever accusation Robb was about to toss at him. About Commander Mormont, bit out Robb, stepping into the room, Grey Wind slinking in behind him and skirting to the edges, eyeing the Black brothers who just as warily eyed the large direwolf back. About the ranging and what happened. What happened? Scoffed Thorne, who was seated near the hearth, half his face shadowed. The downward turn of his mouth pulled at the purple bruise that stretched from his temple to his jaw. What happened was that we were fucking unprepared. That's what happened. It was fucking chaos. Your Majesty. Thorne, that's enough, ordered John in a frosty voice Robb had never heard. The Targaryen loyalist sent his scowl at the commander, and his gravelly voice cut through the silence of the room. Enough? Don't think your precious king in the north has a right to know what you think is coming, Lord Snow. Think is coming? Echoed a black brother near Jon. Think? Thorne, you saw it just like the rest of us who managed to get back. I didn't see anything, the man in question roared, standing from his seat. And what about those who didn't return? Asked Ren, his voice and eyes pointedly fixed on the older man. Thorne seemed to want to spit, but refrained. However, it left a look of distaste on his face instead. Deserters. Or dead. No thanks to those wildling cunts. Behind Robb, framed in the door, Hermione appeared with Eddard panting heavily beside her. The Blackfish was close behind, his cheeks flushed. Jon glanced at them and then turned back to Robb. We need to prepare for what's coming. But you haven't said what's coming, Snow. Just these half-truths and riddles. Protested Robb, his hands clenched into fists at his side. Speak plainly, damn it. Jon's lips thinned and his nostrils flared in annoyance at the tone Robb took. That is a conversation meant for the rest of your council to hear as well, your majesty. Robb's eyes narrowed, and the two half-siblings stared at each other for a few tense moments. Hermione took the opportunity to move into the room, cautiously, her eyes on Robb until she was at his side. She touched his arm lightly, a graze of her fingertips. Robb's entire body trembled. Commander Snow has the right idea, she murmured at Robb. Get some rest, think about what we've learned, and let's discuss it tomorrow. Without removing his eyes from Jon, Robb slowly nodded. Just remember, brother, stated Robb, his voice low, that you asked for help. It has come. Now is not the time to hold information close to the chest. Then he spun, giving his back to the Night's Watch in the room. He reached for Hermione's hand and took it gently, although his every action was sharp and punctuated with quick bursts of energy. Behind them, Grey Wind growled once and then followed, with Ed and the Blackfish eyeing not only their king, but those who remained behind in the room until they too walked away. Hermione waited a few moments and several hallways and stairs later before speaking. You know, she began, causing Robb to glance at her in curiosity. Of all my bad traits to pick up, I never expected you to take my impatience and need to burst into closed meeting to argue your points. Robb stopped walking and looked at Hermione blankly. What? Hermione stopped as well and looked up at him, a tiny twist to her lips on her face. Shouting your opinion? Being emotional? Doesn't that sound familiar? Behind, Ed tried to hide a snicker. I distinctly remember when I shouted at you in a meeting, helped Hermione, a knowing look on her face. Something about not sharing information, certain battle near River Run. Understanding dawned on Robb's face. And then you cried and ran out of the room, finished Robb, a fond look on his face. Hermione raised her eyebrows in response to that. And then I ran out of the room. Gods, I was so angry with you, questioning me in front of my men, Robb sighed and shook his head. Those were the early days when you still weren't sure about Westerosi custom. Agreed Hermione, although her voice was much more pointed this time. It took Robb a moment to understand what she meant, and then he heavily sighed, a sheepish blush on his cheeks, nearly matching the auburn of his hair. I think it might be best if you sleep on this and start fresh tomorrow, interjected Hermione. Robb glanced around, noting Ed's carefully blank face, and then his great uncle's, which matched Hermione's, sensing he was outnumbered. As Ed was unlikely to say anything in defense of his king, when there was a witch who could render him mute, Robb nodded and ran a hand through his curly hair. Tomorrow, he agreed, as the group began walking again. This time in the direction of the rooms they were assigned in a nicer guest tower. But I want everyone there, Uncle, he said, turning to face the Blackfish, who nodded, a full council of whoever is here and can be spared. I want to know what's going on with the others and all knowledge the Night's Watch has on them. Concern spread across his face. I have a feeling we're going to need every bit of knowledge necessary. The next day, the discussion with the Night's Watch did not go smoothly. It began well enough, although Jon and the other Black brothers seemed wary of Robb and his cool facade when the king in the north and his council arrived for discussions, with Maester Aemon regurgitating most of what he had said to Robb the day before. Things seemed straightforward. Until, with every person the whites and others kill, it's another body to their army, said Jon passionately, his eyes sweeping the room. We cannot allow them to increase their army. We need to help the free folk. There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted. The Black brothers and Northmen alike were aghast and shouting at Jon. John listened to the cacophony of noise before he finally banged his closed fist's hand on the table, causing everyone to fall silent. "We have no choice. We must open the gates for the free folk to enter the north," he cried. "If we do not, they will only become part of the other's army, and that will be one more white to deal with when the time comes." A few men around the room scoffed, but Robb felt himself frown. He glanced around at his council and the lords of the north with him in the room. Many, especially those who lived closest to the wall like Stark and Umber, were scowling something fierce. "Listen to me! Listen to me!" John was shouting, trying to be heard. "You either fight for the living or are an enemy of the living," from his seat and from behind the laced fingers he held up to his mouth. Robb watched the room, watching as it unfolded into anger. Theoretically, Robb agreed with John. They couldn't allow the others to continue to build their army with the bodies of the wildlings beyond the wall. But he also knew that their culture was so different from the North's that even if they settled them in the North, they likely wouldn't be able to adhere to the Northern rules and customs. There has to be a solution, thought Robb, his mouth pulling down. He found himself glancing at Hermione, who silently sat on his right, her amber eyes keenly watching the debate. "The gift is the only place for them," continued John, his voice loud and heard over the noise of the room. The arguments around him were dying down. "There's enough free land for them to till and build." "And enough fertile nearby land to rape and pillage," argued Umber hotly. He jabbed a finger into his chest. "My lands?" Stark, nearby, was nodding along in agreement. John protested. "They wouldn't—" "You can't promise that," shouted back Stark, his whiskery mustache quivering in anger. "Don't make those kinds of promises, Lord Commander." Before the argument could descend further, Hermione stood up. "Look, it's clear that we're not going to reach a consensus on the topic today. Why don't we take a 30-minute break, cool off, and then come back to this topic? I might have some ideas that would work for everyone." Angrily, Stark huffed and sat back in his seat, and a few other northern lords murmured their agreement. However, one voice rose above the rest, cutting through the room like a blade. "I don't take orders from a jumped-up chit or some king's whore," spat Thorne. Stunned, Hermione fell back into her seat, staring with wide eyes at the man she hadn't even really spoken to before. Immediately, Robb was on his feet, the sword of Gryffindor unsheathed. At his side, Ed mimicked his king, although his sword arm was nearly shaking with repressed rage. Around them, the men on Robb's council were shouting insults and outrage at Thorne, who bore their words with a deep scowl. "How dare you," seethed Robb. "How dare you." The room went quiet, with only the sound of Grey Wind's low growl to indicate just how close Robb was to losing control of the situation. Hermione reached out and gently placed a hand on Robb's arm, the one that held the sword. He didn't glance at her, but his form softened a bit at a touch. It gave Robb time to sweep his blue eyes around the room, catching several black brothers who looked away in shame, and then finally John, who appeared shocked. "I think we're done for tonight," said Robb lowly, his voice still a thick rumble. He sheathed the sword of Gryffindor back in its case with a loud snap. "This conversation can continue tomorrow when clearer heads will prevail, and men will not childishly insult women just because they're chauvinistic pricks." Thorne blinked for a moment, mouthing "chauvinistic" to himself as Robb pushed away from his chair. His council, the few not already on their feet, copied him until everyone was standing. Hermione rose slowly too. Robb nodded at John, whose face was solemn as he nodded back. "A good idea, King Robb. Let's convene over lunch in the Great Hall tomorrow. Until then, good night." John's gray eyes flicked to Hermione. "My lady." Hermione didn't speak, but demurred with a small smile and wriggled her fingers in goodbye as Robb wrapped a hand around her arm and led her from the room. Once they had gone down the hall and were well out of hearing distance from the room, Robb stopped, spinning on his heel to face his council, who all wore grim looks. "While I recognize we're not likely to come to any accord," began Stark, his whiskers twitching, "this evening demonstrated how much of unmitigated disaster the Night's Watch is." "Their leadership is fractured," agreed Bolton quietly. "They are fractured." "If everything we've learned is true," added Umber, with a rumble that was quiet given his loud voice, "then how can we believe that the Wall will maintain its defenses against the others?" The chilling thought made everyone pause. "We can't do anything about it now," sighed Robb, "but I do urge you to try to be more open-minded tomorrow during talks. John, Commander Snow is right that we don't want to give the others more bodies for fueling their army, but," sighed Maggie when Robb trailed off. The king grimaced. "Yes, but," Wildings in the north, settling in Brandon's gift? He shook his head. It does not bode well. The group stood silently for a long, tense moment. We can't do anything else tonight, Hermione finally spoke up, her voice quiet. Let's just get some sleep. Maybe something will come to us in the meantime that we can attempt to convey tomorrow. Robb nodded. Let's meet for breakfast in my solar. Any ideas? Any suggestions so that we can appear united tomorrow would be appreciated. The council murmured their agreement and good nights until only Robb and Hermione's guard in the form of Ed, Patrick, and Lyra remained. Robb looked around at everyone, his eyes lingering on Hermione as he muttered, "Let's go," with Grey Wind silently padding alongside the king on his other side. He kept quiet the entire walk back to their assigned quarters. No one was kidding themselves anymore that Hermione was keeping to the room. She was assigned, dismissing Ed, Patrick, and Lyra with a sharp nod. He ushered Hermione into the room before him, and only after Grey Wind went in first as an advanced scout, using his nose in case there was any danger. Once inside, Robb slammed the door shut and then allowed his furious mood to bubble to the surface. Having repressed it during their walk, he was muttering under his breath insults, something about Thorn and a moment alone with Grey Wind. Hermione leaving him to stew while she went directly to the chest of drawers. She was using as a makeshift desk. She picked up a few loose parchments, reading the latest correspondence that Sauron sent regarding plans at Winterfell, including what Sansa and Arya were up to. He's definitely right to be cautious regarding those two, thought Hermione fondly. She was so focused on her readings, making appropriate and noises that she completely missed what Robb said until it caught in her brain. Can you believe that man? Who does he think he is? A snort. What a jumped-up bastard, Targaryen, loyalist. It was an insult, Hermione, an insult. Not just an insult to me, seethed Robb, sitting on the bed and yanking his boots off viciously, but an insult to you and the entirety of the North and Riverlands. Alliser Thorne. There was a sneer in Robb's voice. Insulting you. The Winter Witch. The woman who will become queen in the North. You've done more for the gods' forsaken country than most will ever know. The paper fell from Hermione's hands and she froze in shock, her entire being stilled while Robb continued to speak, this time muffled as he reached over his neck to grab at the back of his shirt and pull it up and over. How that man was Jorah Mormont's master of arms. I have no idea. There's not a single diplomatic bone in his body. What did you say? Robb stopped speaking and glanced at Hermione, who stood rigid, her back to him. Frowning, Robb repeated that he's not diplomatic at all. No. Earlier. Robb's frown deepened, thinking back to his emotion-fueled rant. Suddenly, the words he spoke caught up to his brain and his mouth snapped shut. His confused gaze turned wary, and he slowly stood. Is this about the... He paused and licked his lips nervously. The future? Future? Echoed Hermione, a tremor in her voice. Robb, I mean, not that I'm not flattered or something, but, we're 20, and, Robb reached out and gently touched Hermione's shoulder. She spun, her brown eyes wide as they darted everywhere around the room. But at him, and her hair frizzled, sparking just the tiniest amount. He eyed her corkscrews warily, and then deliberately caught her chin with his hand, holding it in place gently, with only the smallest amount of pressure, so that she could pull out if she wanted. You know I want you, he said, summoning his courage. His voice was low, intimate. I thought that we were both clear on that. Yes, but maybe things are different in Britain, Hermione, continued Robb, speaking over her and holding her gaze. But here, it's more than I just want you, he said, glancing down at her from head to toes, the look scalding and sending a heated rush through her body. I want all of you. Body. He slid his free hand down to wrap around her waist. Mine. He leaned forward and touched his forehead to hers, and he felt her eyes flutter shut more than saw as he copied her. And so he breathed the last, nudging just a bit closer to slide a butterfly kiss across her lips, and that means forever. For me. Robb, is this about being queen? Say the word and I'll step down, he continued. I won't lie, I'll hate it. These men put their trust in me, and I want to see it through. My honor would demand nothing less. But if it means losing you, Arya can take over. She can be queen in the North. Hermione tilted her chin up a tiny amount, peering up at Robb from under her lashes, as he gazed down at her. He let the hand holding her chin drop away, finding her right hand, and then clasped them together, lacing the fingers together and bringing them up to his mouth to kiss her knuckles. Together, remember, he reminded her, his voice low, you and me, no matter what. I don't know if Hermione broke off and swallowed heavily. This is a bit fast. Then we'll go as slow as you want, answered Robb earnestly. I know things are different for you, that courting is different in Britain. Hermione bit back a hysterical giggle. And no one needs to know, he continued. I mean, my men will probably expect something sooner rather than later, even if it's just a betrothal announcement. Most know that we share a room, and I'm sure they don't want any illegitimate children running around. Oh my God, Robb. Hermione's face turned bright red. We haven't exactly been careful, he disagreed, a frown on his face as he pulled back a bit. And these things can happen. Yeah, no, nervously laughed Hermione. There's a potion, Robb blinked. Oh, you've been, taking... Hermione nodded her head rapidly. Her face still flushed very pink. Robb was silent for a long moment. Well, he freed a hand and raised it to scratch at the side of his cheek, where his fuzz was growing into a very ginger beard. Hermione thought it made him look older than he was. His blue eyes flicked back at Hermione. How long will it last? Oh, months, replied Hermione quickly. At least. Good, replied Robb, a slow smile stretching across his face. It looked rather filthy when it reached his eyes, turning the blue into a deep color that reminded Hermione of a storm at sea. He reached for Hermione again, drawing her flush to his body. So we have time then. Hermione nodded slowly, mesmerized, her mouth slightly parted. I won't lie, Hermione, continued Robb, his voice low. You know what I want in our relationship. You know where I stand. I will court you if you allow it. Properly, in northern fashion. Will you let me? Hermione blinked and frowned. Would that mean I'm making a decision, agreeing to the courting? No. Robb shook his head. Just that my intent is there. And maybe it will get Stark off my back about betrothing you to Ed. Or even Harrion. Hermione's mouth twitched. Robb saw and glared. Stop it. It's kind of funny. It is not. Robb knew he sounded petulant. Hermione laughed. It really is. Me being desirable to any degree is funny, given how my Hogwarts years went. You said what's the word, dated? Asked Robb. Yeah, kind of, agreed Hermione. One date with a boy from a completely different school, from a completely different country, a pseudo-date with a jerk that I used to make Ron jealous, and then one very awkward kiss with Ron in a wet, moldy, secret lair with a giant, rotting basilisk corpse. There was a twinkle in her eye as she deadpanned, I'm very experienced, you see. Robb stifled a snort and gathered Hermione close into a hug, rocking them slightly back and forth. You're perfect the way you are. Hermione sighed into his shoulder, clutching at his back. I can't make any promises, Robb. Not right now. That's okay, he muttered into her hair. Just promise me you'll think about it. Okay. Okay. Hermione drew back. Then court me, your highness. Robb grinned, drawing Hermione toward the bed and allowing both of them to fall into it. Hermione resting comfortably on him. Excellent. Of course, there is one part of the courting that I think we should ignore. Which is... Robb leaned forward and kissed Hermione. Her body melted further into his, and he drew her closer, then rolled them so she was below. Their breaths intermingling, he stared down at her with a wicked grin and answered, well, the whole sex before marriage thing that your world has figured out. I really like it. Hermione laughed, loudly. Are you trying to win me over with sex? Robb drew back a bit. Is it working, he asked, excitedly. I know, snorted Hermione, bringing a hand up to trace at the side of Robb's face. I think I need further convincing. Excellent idea, murmured Robb, descending to kiss Hermione until she was breathless, panting beneath him. Clothes were removed in a hurry, and Robb spent the rest of the evening convincing the witch to stay with him between moans, kisses, and words of love and adoration. He hoped it would be enough. He hoped it was enough? The next day of discussion was going as well as the previous had. Stark and Umber had teamed up and put their collective feet down, an immovable force that had no intention of allowing any wildings near their land. John, Robb could tell, was incredibly frustrated by the lack of movement on the discussion. He wanted everyone to get along, something about free folk or people too, but some prejudices and fears were ingrained too deeply, even when faced with the supernatural. Thorn, Robb was pleased to note, was not at the lunch meeting. I hope John rebuked him, thought Robb viciously. his lingering anger over the man's words at Hermione still enough to wish him ill on the man. Hermione, on the other hand, was listening intently to Stark rant about historical precedents of wilding attacks on his land, her eyes flickering between the older Northern Lord and Jon, whose face was growing more despondent as the afternoon progressed. Finally, she cleared her throat. Lord Commander, she began, and instantly Stark snapped his mouth shut. Yes, asked Jon, perking up only a little. Could you clarify something for me? Confused. Jon nodded. Hermione stood from her seat next to Robb, rummaging through her ever-present beaded bag and pulling out a familiar map. It unrolled across the long table they were seated at, and Robb, along with several others, leaned forward to look at it. Oh, he thought. It's the same map that she used to find my siblings. Drops of his blood, still as red as when he first pricked his finger, were on the map. Only this time, 2 were at Winterfell, and 1 was at Castle Black. Another was north of the Wall, near the Frostfangs, and the other still on the island of Skagos. Hermione had been adding to it, with her growing knowledge of Westeros. There were more details and holdfast than when Robb last saw the map, and she had spent some time adding information north of the Wall, so she must have spoken to Maester Aemon or Tarly at some point. She even had numerous towers along the Wall. How many of these towers are in use? She asked, pointing to them along the Wall. 3, replied Jon, his voice soft. The Shadow Tower, East Watch by the Sea, and Castle Black. Which means that there are, Hermione paused and counted, nearly 15 unused towers. How come? Jon glanced at Maester Aemon and Sam, who cleared his throat and spoke, lack of numbers, my lady, and, some dark histories in places like the Night Fort. So if you had the numbers to man these towers, would you use them? The Black brothers in attendance looked at her like she was crazy, because obviously, yes, they would. Jon saw the looks and quickly spoke. Yes, of course. But the numbers we need to not just man the towers, but also repair and staff them, and then produce food. What numbers would you need? Jon's mouth shut. He shared a look with Sam, and then with Gren and Ed, and Tom and a few others he knew before, turning back to her and Robb. There was a tiny smirk on Robb's face, indicating that his brother wasn't going to help him any. Began Jon. Maybe a couple thousand? He cringed. More would be better. Satisfied, Hermione crossed her arms. Then that's your solution. What? I beg your pardon. Hermione ignored Jon and turned to the room at large. Umber was the first to comprehend and began nodded, stroking his beard. Thoughtfully. I could live with that. Shocked, Jon turned to the large man. But the repairs, I can do that within a day or so, replied Hermione. So, long as I have material to work with, if we need to do full replacements. So, stone or wood, maybe hay. She paused. We could probably repair all 15 towers in around 2 weeks' time. Maester Aemon thoughtfully hummed from his seat. That is very kind of you, Lady Hermione. But it still wouldn't help the food situation or any potential issues with discipline. Hermione shrugged. I can help with the food, but not the discipline. What's going on? Whispered Gren, loudly. Lady Hermione has suggested that we let the Wildings use the unused towers, explained Jon with a sigh, and to help man the wall against the others. This way you don't upset those who live the furthest north, explained Hermione with a nod at Stark and Umber, but you also get help in defending the wall. It's a workable solution, agreed Robb. But the discipline... Jon held up a hand. We can work with it, assign towers to different clans, let them sort things out within, ensure that the only rules are that they won't venture too far south into someone's land. I might be able to help with that, mused Hermione aloud, but I want to think on it a bit more. Jon looked around the room, hopefully. So we have a plan? An agreement? There were some murmurs, but nothing contentious, and the slow smile stretched on his face. Just then, Patrick Mallister strode into the room, straight toward Robb. He bent at the waist and muttered into the king's ear, Your Highness, a group of men just approached the Black Gate. They're asking to meet with you. Curiously, Robb turned to Mallister. Who did they say they are? Patrick's mouth thinned. They call themselves the Brotherhood Without Banners. They're led by a man named Beric Dondarrion, whom another man claims was personally appointed by your father to free the Riverlands from tyranny. Dazed, Robb blinked a few times. My father? He appointed this man? Why now? Why are they here, or all places, and not Winterfell? Robb? The king turned and looked at Hermione, who was peering up at him, biting her lower lip. Is everything okay? She asked quietly. Yes, he murmured back. but then cut his eyes to his brother, who was watching worriedly. Lord Commander, I apologize, but something has unexpectedly come up. I will have to cut this discussion short. He glanced around. Lords Karstark, Umber, Lady Mormont, Uncle, those he named turned to him. Would you mind staying and coordinating with the Lord Commander? A schedule perhaps for when Hermione could go by the towers with some brothers as guides.
Of course, Your Highness, answered the Blackfish.
Excellent. Then please excuse me, said Robb to the room at large, rising from his seat. Those around rose in deference for the king, and Robb held a hand out to Hermione. She took it and joined him. Lord Bolton, Lord Flint, would you accompany us? Bolton nodded while Flint, the tall, thin man who rushed back to let Hermione and the others know what Mage had discovered at Castle Black, nodded sharply. They made their way to the courtyard by the Black Gate, following Patrek Mollister as he kept up a muttered conversation to his king. They just appeared, Your Highness. None of the scouts saw them coming, and with the way that they're dressed and how they walk, they must have been living off the land for some time. Robb hummed thoughtfully, and then they were there. The group consisted of no more than 20 men in total, of varying shapes and sizes, but they all shared the same petulant, grimy face and stare in their eyes. Their clothing was similar enough that it looked patched together, or at least that their items were mismatched and taken for whatever value and necessity they warranted, rather than style. A few men, in particular, stood out, a large, rotund, bald man in faded red robes with a short beard, a tall and skinny young man with dirty light brown hair that was stringy and long, held back by the bandage that wrapped over his head and across one eye, and a tall man with a quiver on his back and side. You asked to see me, called Robb, as he walked forward, coming to a halt, a meter or so from the three men that stood out as leaders. You are Robb Stark, the king in the north? The bandaged man asked, stepping forward. He was taller than Robb, but not by much. His skin was pale, so white it was almost translucent, and when he spoke, there was an airy, wispy quality to his voice. Lord Eddard Stark's son? Robb nodded. I am. And there was a brief pause, and then the man who spoke sank to one knee. Immediately, the others behind him did so, too. Robb paused, blinking as he took in the sight. Hermione said from just behind him. The bandaged man looked up, still kneeling. My liege, I am Beric Dondarrion. Your father sent me with a company of men to find Gregor Clegane and bring him to justice for his crimes. Unfortunately, your father died before we completed our task, so we continued the work. However, Dondarrion trailed off, and the man in the red robes spoke up next. His voice was strangely accented. There has been little for us to do in the Riverlands, Your Highness. Even since that strange wall, the stone markers went up. Oh, that was me, said Hermione. I did that, sorry. The head swung in Hermione's direction, and Robb, feeling a bit flustered and annoyed at the continued kneeling, bit out, Oh, stand up, would you? You don't need to kneel at my feet like that. Dondarrion was the first to find his feet, but swayed. The robed man reached out and steadied him while the other, the tall archer, did so on his other side. How was such a feat accomplished? Asked the robed man. And what's your name? Broke in Robb, still a bit annoyed. There was something about this ragtag group that rubbed him the wrong way. He was sure they were accomplished men, but why now? Why are they coming to me now? Where were they before? Before the twins? Before Harrenhal or anywhere else we battled? The man made a theatrical bow. Thoros of Mar. The other man, sensing the need for introductions, added, Angai. Oh, well, nice to meet you, began Hermione hesitantly, glancing at Robb as she did so, and stepping up to be at his side. As for how I did it, well, magic. Thoros' eyes lit up. Magic? He breathed. Are you of the priestess of our Lord of the Light? Of Ashai? Hermione froze. No. A different kind of magic witch, nodded Thoros confidently. From further away. Yeah, kinda, agreed Hermione weakly, glancing at Robb, who gave a tiny shrug. Dondarrion spoke again. Your barrier helped us much, my lady. We were able to hunt down those who committed crimes against the small folk much easier because of it. And when we heard that Gregor Clegane had died, at the hands of a woman they call the Winter Witch, broke in Thoros with a wide grin. Is that you, my lady? Well, there was very little left for us to do, finished Dondarrion. So we headed north, following rumors of where the Northern Army was camped, and went to the Wolf's Wood. It was empty, Angai muttered, and moved on toward Winterfell, continued Dondarrion, as though the others had not spoken, his voice remaining monotone, and then heard of a large battle at Moletown. Not like there was much else to do southways, what with that ghost, muttered Anguy some more. This time, Dondarrion shot him a look as he finished, thus we headed there, and then on to Castle Black, which brings us to now. Now, queried Robb, hesitantly. Thoros, Anguy, and Dondarrion all shared a single, quick look before turning back to face Robb. To pledge ourselves to you and your cause, your highness. The Brotherhood, without banners, is no more. We are now your men. A Brotherhood of the North and Riverlands, just like your own army. Oh. Robb turned to partially look at Bolton, whose eyes flicked just the tiniest bit in deep thought, and then to Robin Flint, who shrugged and said, we could always use more men. Mollister, who remained at Hermione's free side, said nothing, and Hermione turned to Robb, murmuring, it's your call, your highness, wanting to scowl, but knowing it would do no good. Robb turned back to the ragged men. The three leaders dropped to their knees again, against my better judgment. Very well. He cleared his throat. He peered at the men. Do you so swear to seek no harm, to commit to crimes, to fight only against evil, to not raise a hand or sword at the innocent, to strike only when you witness wickedness? We so swear, Dondarrion led, with Thoros and Anguy following quickly behind, and the rest of the men parroting the words. A tingle raced up Robb's back, and he shivered, just as the wind picked up and snow swirled around them in the courtyard. At his side, Hermione shivered and reached up to rub her arms briskly, looking around warily. Then I accept you into my army as men in good standing, finished Robb with a stately nod. I offer my protection as your lord and king. I offer an ear and counsel when it is sought, and I offer a moral cause should we fight. My king, replied Dondarrion as he rose, what would you have us do? Just find a spot to relax and warm yourself with some ale and bread, said Robb, suddenly tired. We're finishing up some discussions here with the Night's Watch, and then we'll probably be heading back to Winterfell shortly. As you wish, agreed Dondarrion, easily. He began to walk away, leading the men. Anguy and Thoros took up point at the end of the cluster, when Hermione stopped Anguy with a hand on his arm. Sorry, said Hermione suddenly, a quizzical look on her brow. Did I mishear you earlier? You said something about a ghost? Anguy shared a glance with Thoros, who scowled and shook his head. Anguy doesn't know what he speaks of, my lady. No, I bloody do well know, the other man muttered, turning to Hermione. There's a ghost in the Riverlands. A vengeful spirit, if I've ever seen one. Vengeful? How? Asked Hermione, curious. For all her time in Westeros, she had yet to encounter anything similar to the ghosts at Hogwarts. Anguy sighed, looking longingly forward as the rest of the Brotherhood melted into one of the nearby towers, seeking refuge from the cold air. Well, this ghost only hunts a particular house, my lady, he said hesitantly. Which? Asked Bolton, joining the conversation with a sharp bark to his word. Anguy glanced at him and then said, House Freyed, my lord, and then excused himself with Thoros, with a nod at the five standing shock-still in the courtyard. Who could? Muttered Hermione, reaching up to pinch at her lower lip. Daisy? Suggested Mollister, hopefully. Robb frowned. Maybe even my mother, if she survived. Bolton shook his head. It was chaos, then, your highness. The likelihood is minuscule. Robb sighed deeply. But a ghost only picking off Freys. They must be a friend of ours. Or they want us to think that, argued Hermione quietly. We just won't know unless we find them and ask. Can you even ask a ghost something? Asked Mollister quietly. It's hardly a ghost if they're killing, replied Robin Flint waspishly. A shout of King Robb, your highness, interrupted them, and they turned to see a young teen, a black brother, skidding on some snow as he dashed toward them. He caught himself on a wooden fence, righted himself, and continued forward. Robb groaned. Oh, what now? My apologies, your H-Highness, stuttered the young Night's Watch brother as he skidded to a halt before the newly large group. He glanced at the frowning king and then deliberately shifted his attention to Hermione. The Lord commanded H has requested the lady H. Hermione. Whatever for? Asked Robb curtly. It's the Baratheons. Your H-Highness, the young man said, eyes skittering to Robb. Lord Baratheon has returned. Then what does he need me for? Asked Hermione, confused. Is Lord Baratheon asking for me? Are some people hurt? The man grimaced. The numbers are, they lost most of their men, my lady. There was a sharp inhale of air around the group. But he took nearly all his soldiers, protested Ed, eyes wide. That was nearly 5,000 men. How many remain? A bare 1,000. If that, sir, the teen said, revealing his southern heritage in the title when addressing Eddard Karstark. At most I won't make it through the night. Hermione sighed. What about Lord Baratheon? And the woman with him, the Red Witch? The teen shook his head. The W Witch Melisandre is W with Lord Baratheon, but it doesn't look good, my lady. That is why she asked the Lord Commander for your help. Hermione and Robb shared a glance. You'd best go, he finally said, his voice pitched low. But be careful. I don't trust that Baratheon doesn't have something planned. You don't have to warn me, snorted Hermione, shaking her head. That Red Priestess from Ashai bothers me. I don't trust her at all. Take men with you, continued Robb, looking around. Ed, of course. Lyra, Brienne, and... he grimaced. The Kingslayer, too. He might not be able to fight, but he's clever and can suss out most soldiers and plans. Perhaps Mollister and Hornwood. And who does that leave you with? Asked an amused Hermione. She reached up and kissed his cheek. I'll be fine, your majesty. Take care of yourself, too. You know? She turned to the teen and said, lead on. Robb sighed as she walked away. A small entourage with her. It wasn't enough in Robb's mind, but there was little more he could do other than order her away, and Hermione wouldn't do that. He turned back to the Brotherhood and his council, who remained. Let's adjourn to my quarters. I want to speak with Lord Serwyn about how preparations for winter are going at Winterfell, and to see if we can find places for you and your men. Lord Dondarrion. The man nodded shallowly, his pale face whiter than the snow on the ground around them. You have my thanks, your highness. The trip to Robb and Hermione's rooms was without interruption, although there was an increase in activity around Castle Black as the remaining Black brothers wandered to and fro quickly, with bundles of wool blankets or pails of water, all heading towards the Great Hall and largest of the towers, presumably where they were setting up a makeshift infirmary for Stannis' men. Once in his room, Robb sighed a breath of relief, glancing at Grey Wind, who was lounging on his bed in the middle of a nap. The wolf whined in his sleep and rolled onto his side, his back leg kicking at something in his dream. Now, my lords, began Robb, moving toward his desk that he shared with Hermione, although her side was notably messier than his. Take a seat. I'll call up Lord Serwyn. Cole, he heard Thoros of Mar mutter. Robb withdrew his mirror and propped it up. Sclay Serwyn, he called, clearly watching the glass shift and melt, until the man in question appeared. Robb blinked. Serwyn's appearance was frazzled, his eyes wide, and his cry of, Your Highness, was full of terror and panic. Lord Serwyn, are you all right? Asked Robb, leaning forward a bit. Around him, Bolton and Major Mormont mimicked him. The man stuttered, his eyes darting everywhere, until they closed and he sighed. Forgive me, Your Highness. What for? Asked Robb cautiously. It seems that I have... The man swallowed thickly. Misplaced the princesses and Princess Sansa's shield, Clegane.
Misplaced, repeated an incredulous Robb.
Serwyn winced. Princess Arya never arrived for her next lesson, and when searching we discovered that Princess Sansa was missing as well, along with Clegane. You don't suppose the hounds kidnapped them? Asked a horrified Brotherhood member. Let's not be hasty, said Robb with a sharp glance around the room. He moved directly to Hermione's beaded bag and withdrew the map she had been using for the towers, and keeping an eye on him and his siblings. He unfurled it and between his hands stretched it out. There, he thought, spotting both Bran and Rickon's unchanged dots, same as his at Castle Black. But Sansa and Arya were just... He blanched. Your Highness? They're here, he said, through bloodless lips that quickly compressed in annoyance. He looked up from the map. They're bloody here. At Castle Black? Blinked Bolton in surprise. His face turned impassive again, quickly, as he turned to face the door. How curious. Bolton, go get him and bring him here. And take Clegane's sword if he's with them, ordered Robb. I wouldn't be surprised if they took a portkey that was left over, especially to get here so quickly. Portkey? Asked Thoros of Myr with a deep frown. He separated the foreign word into two parts. What is that? Never mind that just yet, snapped Robb, rolling the map up and shoving it back in Hermione's bag. Finding out what the hell my sisters are doing is more important. Yes, your grace. Soon after, Bolton returned with the perturbed Clegane, who stood above everyone else in the room, and at the back of two young women Robb was not happy to see. Hello, Robb, greeted Sansa with a wide smile. Arya gave a tiny wave and radiated smugness. Sansa! Arya. Robb's eyes cut over both, and quickly Sansa's smile slipped from her face, just as Arya's smug demeanor shifted to worried. Aren't you happy to see us? Demanded Arya, hands on her hips. Robb grit his teeth. Oh, ecstatic. Sansa didn't miss the sarcasm. Honestly, Robb, we do have a reason, and it better be a good one, interrupted Robb, sitting behind his desk. He summoned every part of him that he considered kingly, letting the role settle on his shoulders. Sansa and Arya blanched, and he knew that they knew that he wasn't happy. So, let's hear it then. Hours later, Hermione wiped the sweat off her face with the sleeve of her shirt and wearily looked around the great hall that they turned into an infirmary. Some men were still crying or calling out in pain, but Hermione found that she could only stun the men for so long before their infections or the pain from their amputated limbs pushed through her spell. The room was warm, with fires roaring in the two fireplaces on either side of the long, rectangular hall, and there was a cloyingly sick smell of death that hung over everyone. Hermione felt rather tired, and the heat and smell were not helping. She had transfigured many of the tables and benches in the room into cots for the wounded, and others who could be spared were quickly wrapping up bodies and carrying them out for burning just as quickly as Hermione thought she was healing others. "You're gonna wear yourself out," muttered Ed as he sidled up to her. "There's still more to be done," muttered back Hermione, glancing at him from under sweat-dampened curls that stuck to her forehead. She glanced down at her wand with a scowl. "I've only got so much magic in me, too, you know." "As opposed to the Red Priestess," said Ed, and together they turned to look at the woman who was chanting over one of Baratheon's men, intoning something in a foreign language before she touched the man's forehead. His eyes rolled back and he fell limp onto the cot. "Show off," muttered Hermione. Ed's mouth twitched. "Careful now, my lady. Are you jealous?" Hermione scowled. "Hardly." Ed opened his mouth to say something further, but his eyes caught on something past her shoulder, and he froze, his eyes growing wide and round. He suddenly stood straight, and a hand came up to smooth down any flyaway hair from his tied-back bun. Hermione narrowed her eyes on him and then turned. "Sansa?" Following behind the redhead was Arya, who pushed past with a deep-set scowl and crossed arms until she made her way to the far wall, near where Brienne and Jaime sat by the larder door. The young princess threw herself on the bench beside Brienne and slouched down. Baffled, Hermione turned from Arya to Sansa. "What on earth are you doing here?" Sansa's cheeks pinkened. "Arya and I thought it would be a good idea to come help to see the aftermath of a battle, especially if this winter is going to be harsh. We wanted to help. We brought further provisions from Winterfell." What did Robb have to say about this? The pink on Sansa's cheeks flushed red. "Oh dear," said Hermione quietly. She glanced back at Ed and saw that he was doing his best to look everywhere but at Sansa. She turned back to the older princess and said, "Listen, there's no much you can do in here, so why don't you take a list of things I still need to maester? Aemon and Sam Tarly. They can send a runner to me here and you can spend the rest of the evening with them in the library." Sansa's shoulders dropped. "Am I really that useless?" "What?" Hermione's mouth dropped open. "No, not at all. But do you know anything about healing?" "No." "Then it's more like logistics. You are best put elsewhere," replied Hermione with a smile. She reached forward and put her hands on both of Sansa's shoulders. "Really?" Now she summoned a parchment and quill and quickly wrote down a few items, blankets, scrap cloth, buckets for hot water, and handed it to Sansa. "Take Clegane with you. He's here, isn't it? And Ed, too." "What?" squawked Ed. Both women turned to look at him. He quickly cleared his throat and repeated, "But I'm supposed to stay here and guard you, Lady Hermione." "Brienne and Jaime are here," replied Hermione, glancing their way. Brienne was solemn-faced as she spoke to Arya, but there was a grin on Jaime's face. He was clearly enjoying the younger girl's unhappiness. Ed stared at Hermione. "The Kingslayer can't fight." "Well, he could probably annoy someone to death," argued Hermione happily, "and given that the majority of the people in this room are either dying or too ill to fight, I think I'll be fine." "If you say so." Still, Ed sent her a skeptical look. "I am now. Shoo!" She waved both Sansa and Ed off, and while Ed kept looking back, he was soon only looking forward and ushering Sansa out of the infirmary with Hermione's list. She sighed deeply and turned to the soldier at the next bed. "What's your name?" she asked him, looking down at a familiar, weathered face. "Oh, you're the one who came in with Stannis Baratheon before." The man was sitting up in his cot and nodded. He looked tired, with a bruise by his temple and splatters of blood around his neck. A hand was pressed at his side where a stained scrap cloth had soaked up whatever blood was oozing from his body. Hermione knelt and gingerly peeled it away from the man's side. He hissed. "Seaworth," he said through gritted teeth. "Davos Seaworth. Well, let's get this cleaned up, shall we, Sir Seaworth?" asked Hermione genially.
It's not, I'm no Sarah, the man replied, just as Hermione swished her wand and cast a non-verbal Turjo, siphoning the blood up and off his body to see the wound. She flicked and the blood went straight to a nearby bucket with a loud splat.
The wound appeared inflamed and a bit puffy. Hermione sighed and sat on her haunches. Maybe a bit of a salt pack that might help, she thought. She had some salt from the provisions they brought from Winterfell. Hermione fished out the tiny leather bag of it that she brought to the infirmary earlier and used Gemino to duplicate the contents to fill the bag further. Every time she did so, it lost some of its molecular integrity, but there was still enough before the salt she was using was nothing more than white-colored rock without mineral properties. She cast Scourgify on the cloth, vanishing the blood and disinfecting it, and then transferred the salt to the clean cloth. Without warning, she smacked to it the man's side and stuck it there with a sticking charm. Davos Seaworth let out a loud shout and a couple of curses. "The Seven Hells, woman." "It'll stay and do its job," she replied evenly, rising to her feet. The man sighed. "Aye, it will." She gathered up the leather bag, tying it shut neatly, when a hoarse shout from behind her had her turn and asked, "What's going on?" But she froze, the words dying on her tongue. On a cot, several rows over, one of the Black brothers was being held up by a hand tightly clenched around his throat. The brother was scrambling at the hand, holding him, raking his nails across the skin until it broke. But the hand did not bleed. Hermione let her eyes travel down the arm to the Baratheon soldier in the cot, who had sat up like a stiff board. Around his waist was the half-sewed death shroud. The brothers were converting from blankets and cloaks. The man had been dead, and the brother was in the process of his funeral preparations. But now he's not dead, thought Hermione stupidly, just as the corpse turned its head from staring at the now slackened face of the brother to look at her. Its bright blue eyes shone eerily in the hall. Then there was a clatter and a cry. Hermione whipped her head around, and another dead body, this one struggling to rip through its shroud, had rolled and knocked off the cot and onto the floor where it wriggled near a man with a missing eye. He was shrieking as he hopped off his bed. His vision impaired, he ended up stumbling onto the cot behind him, just as that man, who had died moments earlier, opened his blue eyes and wrapped two hands around the man's neck, and then twisted it with a loud pop. It was a mad rush, as those who could stand up and began to turn around, banding together as more and more of the dead, those that the brothers hadn't yet got to for the shrouds, rose up from their cots, while others ripped through theirs. A few cries could be heard from outside the infirmary. Perhaps some of the dead on their way to the fire pit started moving, thought Hermione morbidly. "My lord, King Stannis!" Hermione hauled Davos up as one of the blue-eyed dead men flopped off the bed, unable to do more than crawl at them with his missing legs. Davos made a distressed sound, and Hermione turned to him. He was staring across the room at where Stannis was resting, with several of his advisors around it. Melisandre was flitting between other Baratheon soldiers and her king, and was on the other side of the room, near the main door, when the cry broke through the room. The men parted, with one of them gurgling as a dagger went through his throat. He dropped to the floor, like a puppet with its strings cut. From where they stood, Davos and Hermione could see right at Stannis. His square jaw was unmistakable, but the bright blue eyes were not the Baratheon blue he had previously. "What's going on?" she muttered. "It's the dead," cried one Black brother, withdrawing his sword. "Someone send up the call. Blow the horn. 3 times. It's the dead. The whites are here." Hermione inhaled sharply, and Davos, at her side, shuddered. Her nails ended up digging into his arm, and she asked, her voice barely shaking, "Do you have a weapon on you?" "No," he said, his voice strained. He paused. "Do you?" Relief spread through Hermione. These were not in fairy, they might be similar, but she was a witch, and she knew how to combat the dead. "Oh yes, yes I do." And with that, Hermione pushed the sleeves of her shirt up and stepped forward away from Davos, staring down the numerous bright blue eyes as they turned toward her. Hermione extended her wand arm to the nearest inferi, pointing the tip at it. The lumbering corpse scuttered a bit as it hit the edge of a cot, but then listed to the side and moved toward her, reaching forward with its arms. It was still in the earthy Baratheon colors that marked its origins, but Hermione moved past that. There was no point thinking of the man the soldier had been, but rather what he was now. She narrowed her eyes. Inflammare, she whispered, concentrating on the walking corpse as she spoke the spell. Hot blue-tinged flames burst from her wand in a pinprick stream, slamming into the inferi with all the force of a solid punch, sending it reeling back for a moment, off kilter. It then began to scream, shrilly, as the blue flames engulfed the figure. Moments later, with the heat and strength of the spell, the corpse soon disintegrated. Although they were rather mindless, the remaining wights and those who reanimated as they died soon turned to look in Hermione's direction. She swallowed thickly and turned to mutter at Davos. Get to the others. She didn't see the man, but she heard him mutter, right, and felt the air displace as he picked his way around the cots, sometimes stepping on them as he moved away from her. Now then, she said, turning back to the growing number of dead. She refused to count, but there were more than 24, of varying shapes and sizes. She was only thankful that this was the infirmary, and that none had access to their usual weapons. Who's next? Hermione's eyes traveled the room, taking in the clusters of living. A few of Stannis Baratheon's men, advisors, or aides de camp of some sort, were reeling from the reanimation of their liege, with 2 mustering their courage, and another one pleading for Stannis to come back to us, sire, please. Please don't, your highness. Until the man's last words gurgled as his head was ripped from his body by a wight that snuck up behind him. Brian and Arya were the only 2 with swords by the larder, but Jaime Lannister had picked up a cast iron pan from somewhere, presumably from the larder itself, which might have doubled as a pantry, and was swinging it at any nearby wights with his left hand with zest. Davos was picking his way across the floor, carefully sticking to the walls, as he beat back any wights that came close to him, with the legs of a chair he had picked up. The leg ends were red with blood and bits of cloth, indicating that he was stabbing and goring any of the dead that came close. The last few survivors of the room, 2 Black brothers and Melisandre, were on the far side, the furthest from everyone else, having been giving last rites when the men began to turn. There was 1 Black brother left, but he was shifty-looking, and took 1 glance around the room and made a break for an open window, jumping out of it with a shrill cry. His companion stared after him, mouth agape, until he turned around, only to be pounced upon by 2 corpses. His own screams rent through the air, and Hermione found herself swallowing back bile. Melisandre seemed calm and collected amongst the chaos, but even from where she stood, Hermione could tell her eyes were a bit wider than normal, and she was nervous with how they darted around, looking for an exit. The others can hold their own for now, she thought, and thrust out her free hand at a nearby corpse, thinking expulso. The dead body went flying back into 3 others, bowling them over comically. Hermione stared down at her hand in amazement. I've never managed wandless magic to that extent before. She blinked a few times, then remembered she was in the middle of a battle and looked up, her face hardening. The snarls of the 3 wights she had knocked over told Hermione that she just made herself a target, more than she had been before, as they struggled to get back to their feet. Can they think? Are they mindlessly drive by hunger like in the Muggle movies? Are they being controlled by something or by a thought? She wondered, eyes narrowed as one on a cot struggled to free itself from its death shroud, only to tip over directly toward Hermione, its jaw working soundlessly to gnaw at her. She hopped backward, her heart pounding in her chest with panic and fear. In response, her wand tip touched the corpse's forehead as flames burst from it with shrill incendio, scorching the face black and melting what was underneath. The corpse flopped back, unmoving. Ugh, gagged Hermione, her face twisting in disgust as she brought her free hand up to cover her mouth from the sight and smell. 2 more inferi crossed the room, one listing badly to the side with its uneven body weight from a missing limb to its shoulder. The human must have bled out before help could arrive to cauterize the wound, with its other hand outstretched. Reducto. The outstretched limb went flying, landing somewhere out of Hermione's line of sight. Reducto inflammare. Her spells hit with precision and direction that Hermione had only seen before in Harry, Dumbledore, and perhaps Remus when dueling. As someone who once failed her final defense exam, a part of Hermione wondered at her newfound ability and skill to hit her marks, but another part worried about it and shuddered at the idea of the magic of Westeros and the Wall affecting her. However, she had no time to consider her fears regarding her magic and abilities as a cold, clammy hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around harshly, yanking it from its socket. Hermione bit back a loud cry of pain at the pop and agonizing sensation, only to smell foul breath and see bright blue eyes of a white invade her space, looming forward and down toward her. With a hoarse cry, Hermione physically shoved the dead, but the body was solid and unmoving. Panic mounted as one hand went to her hair, winding its hand, which was slowly turning dark blue, into the strands. A voice, baffled and incredulous and ridiculously high-pitched, sparked a memory from her past when it pierced the panic in her brain. "Are you a witch or not?" "I'm a witch," thought Hermione, taking a breath and then narrowing her eyes on the white. It was over quickly. In 3 moves, her wand came up with a violent slash as red danced across Hermione's vision. The limb attached to the hand in her hair slackened as her cutting curse smoothly cut through the cool flesh, making the white wobble. Then she sent the corpse back a few feet with her expulso, enough that the bones within its fleshy shell shattered due to its close proximity, making the corpse collapse down on itself, and then finally she lit the thing on fire. The hand still in her hair, however, moved independently of its body and clenched tight. "Ow!" she cried, reaching up and casting Petrificus Totalis on it, freezing the limb and then breaking its fingers as she yanked it from her head, taking a few clumps of hair with it. Irrationally angry, she stomped on the hand a few times before setting it on fire as well. Her anger manifested itself in the spell, and the severed arm quickly turned to graying dust. By the time Hermione made her way across the room to the other woman's side, she was panting, half with anger and half with necessity, as all her lighting of the corpses was turning the room hazy with smoke. Melisandre had somehow managed to channel her own powers in the meantime, whatever they were from her so-called Lord of the Light, R'hllor, and her hands were superheated, giving off an intense wave of heat that scorched the skin off any white that came close to her. The red-haired woman glanced dispassionately at Hermione when they finally stood side by side, the curly-haired witch, staring down the next cluster of dead as they blocked the door out of the infirmary. "I thought they called you the Winter Witch," the other woman commented lightly. The smell of burning flesh was pungent and sickening in the room, the ceiling awash of the thin haze of smoke that was building too quickly to escape through the chimney stack or two. Open windows. Hermione spared a quick glance at the Red Priestess, and then flicked her wand at a white that came close to snap at her. A whip of burning fire lashed out and bisected the corpse through his black brother robes and leathers, cauterizing the flesh and sending the 2 parts to the floor in squishy splats. However, the corpse was still moving, and a flick of her wand ensured flames engulfed the 2 pieces while its arms flailed. "You'll find I'm full of surprises," replied Hermione. Melisandre quirked her eyebrows at the younger woman. "I am learning that." Together, they turned back to face the oncoming walkers. Hermione's magic gave her the ability to fight from afar, but for Melisandre, hers was mainly defense and up close. She would not be useful in a fight. Instead, Hermione cast Incendio, thinking of corralling her magic in the fire only to the dead, and watched as red and orange flames greedily licked up from the floor in a swooshing spiral of fire, which soon immersed one corpse, and then another, until the 5 before her were writhing, and then soon, dust. A path cleared to leave the room. Hermione turned to Melisandre. "You need to leave." A withering glare demonstrated Melisandre's thoughts on the topic. "You're not helping anyone here," argued Hermione. "Go and warn everyone else and tell them fire will slow them down until they chop these things up like firewood. It's the best option they have to survive." The priestess glanced around the room, which was smoky. It was hard to see anything, but there were still some shapes moving in the haze that burned her eyes. Stannis, however, his body was nothing more than ash being scattered by the boots of the dead or living now. She nodded and left without saying anything to Hermione, sweeping out of the room, the red of her hair, dress, and billowing sleeves, the most visible part of the woman as the smoke enveloped her. Hermione pursed her lips. "Rude," she muttered. Then she turned Davos, Brienne, Jaime, Arya, and 2 other surviving aides-de-camp from Stannis Baratheon's army, who had been by his bedside, had banded together by the larder, while Hermione systematically moved through the dead toward Melisandre, the one who had been furthest from the others. The room was still overrun with dead, the majority having split to face Hermione, while the rest moved toward the others who were barely coping with 1.5 swords, a chair, and a frying pan as weapons against the onslaught. Hermione hissed in agitation. At least a dozen corpses were between her and the others. Hermione raised her wand and made a swirling loop movement, watching as a lasso of fire steadily grew and swished around her in graceful arcs. The corpses paused in their steady but slow advance. "Oh, so you do have the ability to think," she murmured, logging the information. "Good to know, but not enough to help you from this." Then she snapped her wand out and let the flaming lasso of brilliantly hot white flame go. It sparked blue and red as the lasso cracked through the air, slamming against 5 dead in one go, its lash hitting lengthwise and burning right through where it hit. Immediately, the clothing worn by the whites burst into flame, and the armor from 2 of them began to melt. Dripping pools of dark silver liquid that ran down their fronts and legs even as they burned. Their weight was unable to sustain the melted and dusty mass from above, and soon collapsed down, merging with the liquid armor. Hermione snapped the lasso back to her, letting it retract into her wand, but it remained sparking, ready to be lashed out, and turned on her heel to apparate over to the others by the larder. As she spun in her apparition, she released the flame lasso spell, and in her re-entry in front of the others, she allowed her spin to continue with her momentum and the lasso to strike at the nearest corpses, turning them into giant balls of flame as the dead shrieked. The heat from her spells and the smoke in the room burned at Hermione's cheeks, flushing her and turning the skin rough. It was like being out too long in the sun and getting a tan, knowing that she'd peel later and suffer from the burn. Sweat dried before it could drip or pool, but the others didn't fare as well as her. Ron was red in the face, constantly shifting her hands on her hilt as the metal heated under her warm hands, and in the heat of the room, she was wearing her full armor, as Brian normally did, and Hermione could see the sweat pooling around her neck and arms. "She must be stifling in that," the witch thought, casting a cooling charm on her immediately. The other woman sighed in relief. "My thanks, Lady Hermione," the tall blonde replied stiffly. "Thanks?" blurted out Jaime, his eyes wild as he looked around the room. Some of the dead were nothing more than piles of dust, while others flailed about and landed on cots, lighting the blankets on fire. "We're in a wooden room. We're gonna die because she's fire-happy. I'd say she's a fucking Targaryen if I hadn't seen her wield more ice than fire before." "We're not gonna die," replied Hermione, turning so her back was no longer to the inferi behind her. Her lasso had taken out 5, but those 5 had tried to evade the flames that engulfed them and had bumped into other whites, setting off a chain reaction that took out at least 3 more. The rest were keeping some distance for the moment. "We bloody are, if you keep lighting them on fire," the blonde shot back angrily. The burning corpses were turning to ash and collapsing in on themselves as he spoke. "A sword would be a much better weapon." "Oh, I'm sorry," mocked Hermione, shooting him a glare. "Let me just pull my sword out and begin slashing at a bunch of zombies with the 0 training that I've had." Hermione snarled back at her. "You don't need training when you've got knights with you." "Are you counting yourself in that number, Kingslayer?" One of the surviving Baratheon aides de camp snapped with a glower as he poked at a curious wight that came close to his end of the cluster with a broken chair leg. The dead were no longer hanging back. "Can we all just shut up?" hollered Davos instead, shaking his chair as the horde of undead began to press in. "We're about to die and you're bitching about weapons. If I had my hand." Hermione finally had enough, spinning around and ignoring a corpse that lunged forward, only to be skewered by Brienne as the sword went through its mawing mouth. "You were a great swordsman. You've been practicing with your other hand, with Brienne," shouted Hermione, leaning forward with her short stature to get in Jaime's face. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Something stricken passed over Jaime's face as he stared down at her. I don't deserve to live, not after what I've done. What good is a bitter night?" Temper gone. Hermione pushed herself on her toes, inches from Jaime's face, and screamed, "Regain your fucking honor, then, and pick up something and fight." The Kingslayer reeled back, hitting the door jamb behind him as Hermione's hair sparked and there was a swell of thick, hazy air that had nothing to do with the smoke. Jaime couldn't breathe, feeling like something was pressing down on his chest, hard, and he opened his mouth wide to pant, to take in whatever air he could, but there were spots in his vision, black ones, and his hand, oh gods, his hand, the one that was cut off, it was burning, and it was agonizing, just as bad when it was first cut. Then it was all over. and Jaime could breathe again. He looked down, flexing his phantom right hand, but his fingertips touched something solid and looked down, staring. A golden hand, flexible, movable, like a reed one, took the place of his missing appendage. It felt and moved like his hand was there, and if it weren't for the golden color, Jaime would swear he had his hand back. He looked up at Hermione. What? Her stare, blazing hot, reflecting the fire around them. Act honorably, Jaime Lannister, and the hand will remain with you. Her mouth was a tight line, and there were stress lines around. So pick up a sword, Sir Jaime, and fight for the living. Mouth open, he stared at Hermione for a long moment, even as she swirled to face a white, wand blazing as she blasted it back. Jaime glanced around the room, spotted a fallen sword from one of the Baratheon men around Stannis' bed, and darted forward low. His shoulders slammed into a white that went up and over him, landing hard on the floor. It screeched something, and then Brienne was there, stabbing it, but the creature scrambled up, pushing itself up the blade without feeling any pain, and she panicked, eyes wide as she yanked the sword back. Then his hand grabbed the hilt, and the sword, an extension of his arm, his body, his thoughts, was slashing through the nearest white, and there was a grin on his mouth, and something was laughing loudly in joy. Oh, he thought, it's me. I'm the one laughing. Then he was on his feet, and it was like the past few months had never happened. Nothing but conviction coursed through his veins, the deep, desiring need to eradicate the enemy in front of him, to destroy every undead white in the room. Between him, Brienne, and Hermione, who burnt the corpses as Jaime and Brienne worked together to hack at them, with Arya darting forward like a sly rattlesnake with her needle, they managed to dismember the corpses and burn them to ash in short order. They were all breathing heavily when the room cleared. The 6 of the survivors in the room looked at each other for a moment, exchanging glances. Brienne and Jaime were breathing heavily, their faces flushed, but nothing could wipe the smile off Jaime's face. He kept looking down and flexing his new golden hand in awe. Arya was rocking on the balls of her feet while Davos stood at her shoulder, keeping a close eye on the girl as if he knew she would dart off. Someone coughed. "Is it over?" hoarsely whispered a surviving Baratheon soldier. His partner, who shouted at Jaime earlier, had been one of the whites they killed. The acrid smoke burned his lungs, but Jaime stood tall, his shoulders back. He nodded at the man. "It is." The Baratheon soldier sighed a breath of relief. "In here, at least," added Hermione, glancing out the main doorway, making him whimper instead. Everyone turned as one to the doorway. "Shall we?" asked Hermione, and then she was striding forward, leaving the infirmary that was filled with nothing but ash and smoke and a few free-burning cots. As she passed those, the fires snuffed out, the air sucked away from them in a strong cyclone that diminished the fire completely. Wisps of smoke wafted up in a gentle motion that dissipated as people walked by. There was no one in the hallway beyond the Great Hall, but there was some distant shouting further away. "Do you think the Red Priestess was able to warn the others?" asked Arya quietly, jogging a bit to catch up to Hermione and to walk at her side. "I hope so." "Me too," whispered Arya. She tightened her grip around her sword. "Whatever it is, be ready out there," replied Hermione, glancing down at the girl and then raising her wand just slightly so she could bring the tip up quickly if necessary. They reached the end of the hallway where 2 large, closed doors barred the way out. Hermione paused in front of them. "Ready?" she asked the others. Brienne and Jaime raised their swords in response, with Arya mimicking them. Davos raised his chair, a determined but resigned look on his face, while the Baratheon soldier swallowed thickly and clutched at his improvised club from a chair leg. With a final nod, she used her wand to open the doors, and they burst from the hallway together as a group, eyes casting around the courtyard. It was mayhem. Several Black brothers had been carting the dead from the infirmary to a burning fire pit in the middle of the courtyard. Due to that, there were bodies strewn everywhere, some mangled and many more fresh killed. Those that had the majority of their bodies intact were rising, eerie blue eyes focusing on the nearest living thing before they moved after it. There were screams and shouts throughout the castle, reminiscent of the wildlings' attack, a week and a bit earlier. Immediately, Hermione turned to Davos and the Baratheon soldier. "It seems that there are more dead inside Castle Black. We can't let them escape. Seaworth and, I never got your name." "Tarber," the soldier stuttered. "Hort Tarber." "Bright, Seaworth and Tarber will go to the gate and make sure it stays closed," she instructed. Devois nodded while Tarber swallowed thickly, his face pale white as he muttered some sort of agreement. Hermione took it at face value as the two gingerly picked their way across the courtyard in the shadows between the torches and out of the light from the bonfire, and then around a corner, disappearing from view. She turned to Brienne, Jaime, and Arya. "Are we gonna kill some whites?" asked Arya eagerly.
Hermione blinked. Yes.
"Yes," she crowed in excitement, evening pumping her free fist in the air. "We need to find the others," continued Hermione, looking at Arya strangely before turning to the two other adults. "We need to find Jon Snow and Robb, the guards, and anyone else who was in the castle." "And the priestess," added Jaime, his voice low. "She should have warned people." "The only dead were those who came in," added Brienne, "so she should have managed to get past those bodies in the courtyard before there was too much panic." "Yes, but," agreed Hermione, stepping forward and peering ahead at the large pile of bodies. "Some were charred, but many were not. It doesn't seem like they got a chance to start the bonfire." Brienne grimaced. Jaime didn't hold back on his opinion. "Lovely," he sighed. "Well, let's go then." He led the charge out, his blade slashing through the nearest open-mouthed white as it lumbered toward them, mouth open. He cleanly bisected the corpse, and following him, Brienne's sword came crashing down, rendering the corpse armless. Arya seemed to be having the time of her life, spearing any separated limbs as arms attempted to wiggle away, holding them in place with needle or her boot until Hermione's wand sent a splash of flame to incinerate the limb. The methodological extermination of whites soon caught the attention of those remaining in the courtyard, and Hermione realized they had fallen prey to the common errors found in Muggle horror films. You don't survive a zombie apocalypse if you're overrun. There were at least 3 rows deep of whites that continued to advance. Their slow walk allowed Hermione's panic to rise. Other whites, attracted to the noise and perhaps fresh targets, wandered into the courtyard. On one hand, the more that came for them was less that went for others. "Or everyone else is dead," a part of her brain supplied. "Merlin," she gasped, jumping back a bit as one white got close enough to rip at her overcoat, the black material tight in its grasp. Behind her, she felt her back just brush against the wall of one of the towers. "7 hells," swore Arya. "How many of them are there?" "Stannis' army had nearly 1,000 men come back," shouted back Brienne between stabs, "and almost all of them died or were near death." "Wonderful," griped Jaime, scowl on his face. He stabbed at a fresh corpse, and blood splattered back at him, making him sputter and hastily wipe it off with the sleeve of his shirt. "Don't let him near you," Hermione shouted at the other 3. Brienne and Jaime fought back to back as the thick line of dead advanced, while Arya's short stature allowed her to slip between whites and their bodies, aiming from underneath with her stabs. Hermione could hear Arya muttering something under her breath. "Quick as a snake, light as a feather." "Why didn't I think of that?" snarked back Jaime, breathing just a touch heavier than normal. "Well, just be pleased, they're not the zombies back home," countered Hermione. Brienne paused just briefly from her swing. "In your world, my lady?" "Yes. Do elaborate," muttered Jaime. "As I need clarification on this, you keep changing their names. They're whites. But you've called them inferi and zombies." "Oh, well, that's easy to explain," began Hermione, almost cheerfully as she slipped into academic vernacular. "There really is no difference. They all tend to mean the same thing. A walking corpse that has been resurrected." She had to break out to shout incendio, stepping in front of those with her as she swept her arm in a wide gesture, the flames bursting from the wand tip with a searing heat. The speed and force of the flame pushed Hermione's hair back and she felt her cheeks burn from the heat. Instantly, the whites in front of her were consumed. That pushed the oncoming line of whites. Arms outstretched over the shoulders of those in front, back, just the tiniest amount for breathing room. Anyway, where was it? Oh yes! In wizarding terms, an inferi refers to a corpse that has been resurrected through necromancy, which is, for a lack of a better term, death magic. Continued Hermione, not breaking from where she finished off previously. She viciously stabbed her wand forward, and a nearby white screamed as it was consumed by flame. Brianna leveled a wide-eyed stare at Hermione in response. "And you call these whites mainly because that is the terminology you are used to," the witch continued, using non-verbal spells. The flame lasso extended past her wand tip and buried itself into the oncoming horde, but when Hermione flicked it back, it merely caught the edges of the whites and burned through their ragged clothing, or merely singed the armor from the soldiers. The previous dead they destroyed were Night's Watch brothers, or men without body armor. But that was beginning to change. Jaime swore as his sword dented a chest plate but did not pierce through the gap between the chest and neck. "Now, zombies can just cover about anything," finished Hermione, "unlike us, who apparently need to spread ourselves out or else we're going to die." This time, Jaime did a spit take and loudly called over his shoulder, "Excuse me." "Divide and conquer, I think," replied Hermione, just as cheerfully, and spun on her heel to apparate out of the semicircle. The dead were making around her, Brienne, Jaime, and Arya. Witch, you come back here." Hermione appeared in an empty part of the courtyard. "No need to hold back," she murmured, and let her arms spread wide as she thought, Incendio Maximus. Instead of the jets of concentrated fire or the bluebell sparks she had previously used, a wall of flame burst from her wand and split, growing in size and height until there was a curtain wall before her. She sent it forward with a directed flick of her wand and began walking with it. Despite the scent of burning flesh, or the sizzle that came with melting steel, Hermione felt giddy with her spell work, especially as the back rows that had advanced on the others were disintegrating almost immediately as the wall moved through them. Others on the fringe of the curtain wall became human candles, wailing and bouncing off one another as they flailed in their spots, or fell over fences, or into buildings. Hermione allowed herself a momentary respite. Of course, that was when a white knocked her over. Hermione hit the cobblestones hard, and her mind immediately flashed back to the Battle of Castle Black earlier, when Immediate had knocked her to the ground. At the time, she was consumed with magic and battle lust, but now fear crept into her as the vacant expression of a soldier leered at her, its blackened and freezing hands wrapping around her throat. The bright blue eyes bore into Hermione's amber ones, widened as she tried to catch her breath, and failed, tried to think expulso to knock the white back, and then blood erupted from the white, coating her face. Hermione screwed her eyes up tight, freezing in horror. The blood was not hot. Instead, it was already cooling and froze further as the cold air sucked the remaining warmth. "Oh, moaned Hermione through unmoving lips. She finally opened her eyes and wished she hadn't, her stomach rebelling at the sight of the soldier's mangled face above her. There was only one eye, no longer bright blue, and the nose and upper part of the mouth were missing. In their place was the very pointed and sharp end of a spear. The spear was pulled back with a sickening squish. Skin flapped, and Hermione could see bone from the soldier, and as the spear was removed entirely from the head, the body collapsed on her.
Hermione shrieked in a hysterical repulso, sent the corpse flying through the air, landing several feet away with a squish and then solid thump. Immediately, Hermione began wiping the blood from her face, spitting as she rolled onto her knees.
A nasty feminine laugh made Hermione freeze, glancing up at the woman who saved her. She was tall, with broad shoulders and close-cropped brown hair that had tight little curls escaping it, making the woman's hair nearly as riotous as Hermione's. She had dark, glittering eyes and a strong body outline by the form-fitting sleeveless yellow tunic she wore. The yellow seemed familiar, but other than its color, her trousers were a light taupe and tucked into thick brown lace-up boots. The spear she carried was taller than she was, and blood dribbled down its shaft, mingling with other dark stains. "This woman has been killing whites just as long as I have," thought Hermione idly. Then Hermione remembered she was a witch, not a muggle, and she didn't need to wipe the blood off by hand. "Targio," she muttered, siphoning the blood off and flicking it away. "Neat trick," the woman commented, holding on a calloused hand for Hermione to take to haul her up. Hermione took it. It comes in handy. She peered up at the woman, in awe of how tall she was. "She's almost Brienne's height." "Thank you, by the way," added Hermione with a wobbly smile. "You don't watch your back when you're confident," the woman pointed out, and although the tone was dry, the words held censure. Hermione frowned. "I'm used to working with two others."
I can tell.
She bared her teeth in a parody of a kind smile. "You should practice more. Practice fighting with someone watching your back. I used to have someone I did that with." Hermione's frown deepened, but this time in sorrow. She thought back of her closest friend in Westeros. She thought of his smile, his brown eyes, and his laugh, and how he was always there for her. He's dead now. He was killed at the Twins. "I'm sorry," the other woman murmured. They both stood still for a moment, and then, without taking her eyes off Hermione, the woman shifted. Her spear twirled in her arms, and then the point was buried in a white that was directly behind her, sagging its weight forward. The woman had punctured the corpse through the head. "You're very good at that," praised Hermione, eyes wide with awe. "And you're going for the headshots." "I've been watching," the woman bit back, yanking the spear from the body. Hermione snapped her mouth shut. You should get back to the others, she finally said, jerking her square chin in the direction Hermione had previously been walking. Hermione turned. Brienne and Jaime were viciously slashing through the last of the whites, and Arya was darting between them. At some point, she had picked up a broken piece of wood, one that was burning, and was brandishing it at whites, hurting them to Jaime and Brienne. Right, muttered Hermione. She blinked. Hey, what's your name? You never said. You're right, I didn't. There was something dark and humorous in the woman's eyes, like she was laughing at Hermione, and Hermione was the butt of the joke. Well, excuse me, muttered Hermione under her breath, turning her back on the woman and making her way to the others. There were barely a handful of whites left, and Hermione concentrated enough to allow for her bursts of Inflamaria's rapid-fire jets, lighting them on fire. They screeched, but were soon ash, blowing away and scattering as Hermione's boots stepped through what remained. When the last body sizzled into a crisp from Hermione's wand, silence fell on the five. The scent of burning flesh lingered in the air, as did the sound of crackling fires. Yet there was a wind blowing, clearing the smoke from the great hall, and the numerous corpses that lined the inner courtyard. The sky above them was clear, with stars, distant yellow dots. A tint of purple was lining the horizon of the eastern sky, signaling the coming dawn. They had been burning bodies and fighting through the night. They stood together, breathing heavily as they overcame their surprise at surviving. Hermione found herself breathlessly laughing, enough so that Arya joined in and they shared a quick hug. Even Brienne had a small smile on her face, but Jaime leveled a suspicious look on the woman that followed behind Hermione. Who are you? The woman smiled back at him, but said nothing. She saved my life, admitted Hermione, a tinge of pink on her cheeks. I got distracted. The woman snorted. She forgot that things can come up from behind. Arya groaned. Hermione. Really? Hermione's blush deepened. It happens. She cleared her throat. Anyway, my hero here speared the white through the head. Well, I think she's been cutting down the numbers too. So is that the last of them? Arya's voice was loud in the quiet. There's no more need to burn anything. Yes, replied Hermione, looking around the courtyard. Whatever white snow there had been previously was now blackened into a dark gray with the ash of the bodies Hermione burned. There were some mangled limbs strewn around, mostly legs or decapitated heads that she did not get to, but there were no more glowing blue eyes in the pre-dawn. Then what's that? The others turned to see what Arya was pointing at. A red glow lit up the elevator shaft to the top of the wall, 2 buildings, and 1 covered walkway over from their courtyard. Hermione started in surprise. I thought we finished with burning the bodies. She exchanged a glance with Brienne and the other woman who had yet to introduce herself, but Jaime kept his eyes focused on the flickering light. A dark plume of smoke rose into the air, and some ashes were beginning to fall around them, carried by the wind. That's the courtyard by the Black Gate, he said instead, lines etching his face. He looked grim. We should investigate. They had to climb up a set of outer stairs to the second-floor covered walkway, trudging single file as they followed Jaime, who was moving quickly. Arya kept pace with the disgraced Kingsguard, while Hermione followed her with the girl in the light yellow tunic and trousers, and Brienne took the rear. At the top of the walkway, Jaime stopped. You hear that? He asked, cocking his head to the side. Hermione strained her ears and heard a shrill feminine scream, followed by muffled words. Then a hoarse yell, full of anguish and anger. Somewhere nearby, Grey Wind howled. Robb, cried Hermione, pushing past Jaime and taking point from their group, rushing down the wooden walkway so that he stepped slapped on the board. She skidded at the end, turning right and bouncing off the stone wall as she entered the building, hewn into the rocks that made the wall, and then flung open a door at the end of the short hall to reveal another set of stairs, this time leading down. She thundered down those, and came upon the outer courtyard, near the dungeons, and opposite the Black Gate itself, guarded by Seaworth and Tarber. Without a door, Hermione was able to burst onto the courtyard, gasped as her eyes took in the scene. In front of her, she vaguely realized the others standing still behind her as they caught up. De Greyjohn was sprawled over Grey Wind's neck, with a nervous Karstark and Bolton restraining the giant direwolf, while a few other members of the Brotherhood without banners attempted a pile-up on the wolf to keep it from moving. Froth and spit dribbled from Grey Wind's mouth, and his sharp teeth gleamed in the early morning light as he kept tossing his head, snapping at the men around him. Robb was being held back by no less than 4 of his guard. His uncle and the Blackfish both had arms wrapped around his chest, pulling him back. Ed was grasping Robb's right shoulder and arm, hauling him back, as Patrek Mallister did the same on the left. The Small John was helping the Blackfish, and all their faces were red and teeth barred, as Robb attempted to move forward with superhuman strength toward the burning barn. He was letting out a sound that was like a wounded animal, fighting against its enemies to the very last, veins in his neck sticking out as the sound crawled up from deep in his chest. "Robb!" gasped Hermione, feeling her heart clench in sympathetic pain. She took a few steps toward him until a familiar feminine voice let out a series of insults, all spat at another woman in the courtyard. "You fucking cunt, you stupid bitch. What did you do? How could you do that? How could you let them do that? I'll kill you, you ginger cunt, you rotten-smelling cunt of a demon." The Griot's arms were outstretched, the hands ending in claws as she tried to crawl her way out of Grennan, and Lord Braken's arms, both were straining against her, digging their feet in as the Griot kicked and bit, spittle flying from her mouth as she continued to shout angrily. "They burned them," the other woman with them said from behind her, her voice small and shocked. Hermione turned to see what she meant, and her mouth fell open. By the 7, she burned them alive. The Blackgate courtyard was a large space. Davos, Seaworth, and Tarber stood by the gate mechanism with Mage and Lyra Mormont, shock on their faces. Clegane had dragged Sansa as far away from the flames as possible, his own eyes wide and fixated on them as they stood near the gate, and Davos and Tarber. He kept her tiny body pressed against the wall, despite the thin young woman trying to reach around him. Tears were slipping down her face, his hair in disarray and her dress ripped in parts, all which told Hermione that at some point they came across whites but survived. To their left were the barn stables where incoming visitors or returning Black brothers kept their horses. However, the barn was completely engulfed in flames that roared and crackled as flames popped and spit into the air. That was what Arya had seen and pointed out when they were a few buildings over. Directly opposite the barn, on the right side of the courtyard, was a large bonfire of dead. However, something else drew Hermione's eyes next to the bonfire, and between it and the barn, several burning posts stuck to the ground with Baratheon soldiers milling about them, with dazed looks in their eyes. The bodies hanging off the posts were nothing more than charred crisps, each manacled to chains that hung down from rings near the top. Melisandre was standing between each of the fires, the execution posts, and the bonfire, her arms outstretched so that one hand was reaching toward each fire, her head tipped back in ecstasy. There were a few others slumped on their knees, their hands behind their backs and their shackles. They wore shaggy fur coats or just thin shirts, shivering in the cold even as the heat from the burning barn or posts warmed their fronts. "They're the wildlings," thought Hermione, blinking in shock. Then she realized what the other young woman had meant when she said they were burned. Melisandre had found the time to gather the prisoners from the attack on Castle Black and was sacrificing them, burning them along the bodies of the Whites. Jaime Lannister made a noise behind her, something strangled as he took in the sight and smell of burning flesh. Hermione's eyes landed on several members of the Night's Watch clustered together and staring at the barn in dismay, or others who were warily watching the Red Priestess as she organized the few remaining Baratheon soldiers toward the prisoners. "Why aren't they stopping her?" cried Hermione, and then she tapped into her magic, accidentally apparating and appearing in front of Melisandre, her wand digging into the fleshy underside of the woman's chin. The priestess lowered her arms. Slowly, she peered down at Hermione, as much as she could from the extremely tipped back position her head was in. "Winter Witch," she said, although there was weariness in her voice, "have you come to witness the sacrifices for the Lord of Light?" "Why are you doing this?" hissed Hermione, pushing her wand further into Melisandre's chin. "It's for the Watch," interrupted one of the Black brothers, causing Hermione to turn. Although she kept her wand on the other woman. It was a weedy man that she had seen before, spending time with Thorne, although that man was standing to the side, watching the burning burn warily with his arms crossed and a sour expression on his face. "What?" asked Hermione, her tone frosty. "What do you mean by that?" "We were thinking it," the man replied mullishly, "that the commander, well, he let in wildlings, didn't he? That's not what the Watch does." Robb howled, something behind them, the words lost. The Lord Commander." Hermione's brain stuttered to a pause. "What does Jon have to do with this?" She wondered, her eyes trailing from the Black brother in confusion to the other standing and facing the burning barn, to Melisandre. In her confusion, the wand lowered a bit and the woman's red eyes were sympathetic as she peered at the younger and shorter woman. Things clicked into place. No. Hermione spun around and stared in horror at the barn just as the man kept speaking behind her, as though she had to understand. There was something desperate in his voice as he spoke, too. Jon Snow was going to destroy the Night's Watch, the man babbled. He was going to lead the wildlings through our gates, as no Lord Commander has ever done before. And the others here? The wildlings, whispered Hermione. Why are they being burned? The man shrugged. Better kill him now, and if that other witch wants him for her spells or rituals, fine by me. An incredibly indignant part of Hermione bristled at the wildlings being killed. Like her ancestors, witches and wizards burned at the stake for being who they were. And another part of Hermione burned hot in rage at the sheer indifference and ingrained hatred the man had for the wildlings. Earlier, they had managed to come up with an agreed deal for everyone, and this man and others had jeopardized that. Who else? She asked, her voice low. What? Who else was involved in this? Hermione couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't think what it meant for Robb's half-sibling to be burned alive. Hermione might have been able to cast a flame for his charm on herself and walk into the burning barn, but if it had been going for some time now, it was likely that Jon was long dead. She couldn't help him, but she could help avenge him for Robb in the north. The Black Brother looked warily at her, but Hermione flicked her wand and cast a confundus and a mild compulsion, making him more susceptible to answer her questions rather than casting the alluring Imperio. She would avoid any unforgivables, especially when near the wall with how her magic was reacting. The man sang, Bowen Marsh and Ethel Yarwick, and that kid, Ollie. Some others. There were notable exclusions, some even surprising. No Lisser Thorne, no Grin or Sam or Ed Tollett. Thank you. What do you mean? Then Hermione jabbed her wand at him, non-verbally weaving together her transfiguration until the member of the Night's Watch shrunk and twisted, his features popping and melting in other places until only his clothes remained. A startled squeak emerged from within the folds. Melisandre, still at Hermione's side, but a few paces away now that she had moved to the man, took a few steps forward. She knelt, shifting the black cloth away until she revealed a shivering rat. Impressive, the Red Priestess said, and she sounded impressed. As well, your magic is versatile. I don't like traitors, spat Hermione, glaring down at the man-turned rat, and I dislike rats even more. The sound of a few other steps crunching in the snow had Hermione turn to face Alisher Thorne, who was staring down at the rat impassively. When will the spell wear off? Who says it will? Hermione tilted her chin up in defiance, a challenging tone in her voice. Can you reverse it? The sour man asked, his mouth turning down into a scowl. It was his default expression. If I want, replied Hermione, who paused and then added, and I do not want to. The sour look on Thorne's face deepened. Now listen here, witch. The attack on Castle Black near Damwall destroyed us. We're down to less than 20 active men at this tower, and that's now 19. Thanks to you. 18. He blinked. You're down to 18, pointed out Hermione quietly, her voice low and trembling with suppressed anger. Unless you never count Jon as part of the Night's Watch. Jon Snow was my Lord Commander. I had no love for him. That was no secret. But I never once disobeyed an order. The man snapped at her, 2 splotches of red on his cheeks. Loyalty is the foundation on which the Night's Watch is built, and the watch means everything to me. Then why didn't you stop them? She cried. Her voice carried across the courtyard, silent, except for the crackle of the flame. The accusation was as much for Thorne as it was the others. She didn't know when those men had convinced Jon to enter the barn, or how, and she didn't know how long Melisandre had been burning the men. It was clearly long enough that she managed to execute at least 8 of the wildlings. She was at it before we knew, replied Thorne back, hotly. While the rest of us were dealing with those whites, and he looked pained, just admitting it, and by the time we got here, Hermione turned back on the other woman. How dare you? How could you? What gives you the right? Your word gives me the right, she replied firmly, her red eyes flashing, and Hermione's curse wound on her arm, flared up in response. She hitched a breath. I can take these men and their sacrifices and strengthen the Lord of the Light for his fight with the eternal other. You're a zealot, accused Hermione hotly, brandishing her wand at the other woman. A zealot and a fraud. You claimed Stannis Baratheon was your champion, your Azor Ahai, and he's dead, turned into a white, and then destroyed by my magic. Where does that leave you now? Melisandre pursed her lips, clearly perturbed. I admit I was wrong about Lord Baratheon. Behind Hermione, Brienne exclaimed, Wrong? You admit that now? When I watched as a shadowy figure Stannis murdered Renly in front of me, you helped to kill him to become a kinslayer. The Red Priestess was beginning to look caged. Hermione stalked away from her toward the wildlings. Some looked up warily as she approached, knowing she had magic as well, but Hermione just muttered a low mora and watched in satisfaction as their shackles popped open. The largest of them all, a tall man with ginger hair and a nearly blonde beard, stood up from his knees first, gingerly rubbing his wrists where the shackles dug in. He nodded at Hermione and then turned to Melisandre and the few Baratheon soldiers that supported her. They were clustering together with their swords out. "You fucking traitors," one shouted, eyes wild. "You'll kill us all unless we provide to the Lord of the Light." It seemed that was the breaking point for Jaime Lannister as he came up behind the soldier and kicked the back of his knee in, causing the man to stumble. Brienne and the other woman in yellow were quick with him, Brienne with her sword out and the woman with the bloody spear she continued to carry. In the meantime, Hermione summoned the men's swords, not even bothering to move as the steel flew through the air and sailed past her in a downward arc until they landed at the feet of the previously locked up wildlings. Grimly, 4 of them, including the large man, reached for the swords. "The only traitors I see here are the ones who shoved their Lord Commander into a burning barn to die," spat the Kingslayer, because a woman told them it was going to save them. A scuffle to the side, and the members of the Night's Watch seemed to rally themselves, except Gren and Lord Bracken, who continued to keep a hold on Ygritte. Physically, the ones the man named were separated from those milling about. "For thousands of years, the Night's Watch has held Castle Black against the wildlings," one of the men said, staring at the large wildling with his borrowed sword. The wildling looked down at the Black Brother in disgust. "Until now." The man stared up at the wildling in disgust, which faded as the life went out in his eyes from the sword impaled through his body. Aliza Thorne made a noise of complaint, muttering 17 under his breath. "You're going to be down a lot more than that," commented Hermione darkly, glancing at him. He sighed, noisily and heavily, as the wildlings killed the others involved in Jon's murder, and the Baratheon soldiers who were complicit in Melisandre's orders. "We can't defend the wall like this," he muttered to her, crossing his arms. "The plan was to renovate the other castles and put the wildlings there," reminded Hermione, her eyes glancing over at Robb, who, having worn himself out, had fallen to his knees. Her heart ached to go to him, but she had to finish this first. "I'm sure we can have some Northerners stay in shifts here at Castle Black, too. She trailed off and sighed. "We know what we're fighting now." Thorne grunted in agreement, then jerked his chin at Melisandre, who was standing in the courtyard serenely, her hands clasped in front of her as she watched the men around her die. "What do we do about the fire-burning harpy?" Hermione's shoulders dropped. "Keep an eye on her for now. I'll come up with something soon. But first," her eyes drifted to Robb. "I need to..." She left Thorne standing alone, walking over to Robb and sinking to her knees next to him. It was a reversal of how he had approached her at the top of the wall, and now she was the one comforting him as he put her arms around him. Robb tipped his head into her shoulder, eyes fixated on the burning barn.
The dawning sun began to crest over the tallest of the buildings at Castle Black, elongating shadows and stretching them as those who remained in the courtyard kept silent. Only a few left to start a meager breakfast, or for Robb's council to update the others who remained outside by Motown of Jon's death and the diminished Night's Watch. Even the wildlings kept respectfully quiet, the giant man comforting Ygritte, once Gren and Bracken let her go. Arya slinked toward Robb and Hermione, and when Robb spotted her red-rimmed eyes and snotty nose, he made a strangled noise and pulled his youngest sister to his chest. Arya hiccuped on a sob, her tiny hands clutching at her brother, burrowing into him. There was a pattering of feet on snow, and then Sansa threw herself at Robb and Arya heaving sobs as Robb gathered his other sister close and kissed the top of her hair. The burning barn was no longer engulfed in flame, the building creaking and collapsing in on itself with an ominous crash. Hermione winced as fresh flames greedily licked at the wood and hay. "Is there anything you can do?" a strangled voice asked from her shoulder. Hermione glanced down. Robb's blue eyes were dull, and Arya's gray peered up at her from underneath the young king's arms. Sansa's own matching blue eyes implored Hermione to do something. Her heart beat hard. She wasn't immune to the Starks and their pleas. "So I might," said Hermione quietly. "I'll try, anyway." "Thank you," muttered Robb. Hermione pulled herself away from Robb's side, moving to a clear space in front of the barn.
She rolled her shoulders back and stuck her wand out in front of her, closing her eyes as she thought of the spell she needed. The fire-extinguishing spell that Charlie Weasley used at the Triwizard Tournament. A wind spell to clear the smoke, and then levitation charms to move the largest of the structure to the side. Restinguere, Fumus, Finis, Wingardium, Leviosa. Hermione had to repeat that spell a few times. As beams shifted, her next spell sent gushes of water erupting from her wand, dousing any still hot beams or sparking parts of the barn in cold water. Aqua Eructo! White steam burst from the wood and larger portions of the barn that was still intact when the water hit it. The steam soon obscured the burning structure, but Hermione felt confident that it was no longer a danger. She lowered her wand and sighed. Something in the barn creaked. With a furrow, Hermione raised her wand, casting the smoke-removing spell again. Fumus Finis. The white billow of steam thinned, wisping away as Hermione stepped forward, moving her hand back and forth in front of her. Someone in the steam coughed. She blinked. Hello? Another cough, and something was moving through the steam toward her. The figure was shadowed, hunched over as they coughed. Hermione squinted, narrowing her eyes and peering into the steam at the figure, her wand ready in case it was a wight that escaped their purge that previous evening. But a man stumbled out of the barn through the steam. His clothes were burnt off entirely, revealing milky white skin and large areas covered in thick, dark soot. Somehow his black hair managed to survive. Long smudges of gray where he wiped his hands over his body were long lines down his sides and chest. Hermione's eyes widened, and she stumbled back in the snow, closer to Robb, Sansa, and Arya. Behind her, she heard them scrambling to their feet, and Arya shout, "Jon?" Sansa screamed. Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, stumbled forward a few more steps. Jon's gray eyes were wide, a wild look to them as they were staring at his hands in fascination. Following his path, Hermione's own eyes traveled down the sooty chest to the Lord Commander's hands, and then her breath hitched. Flames licked up and down his arms, gathering around his wrists, and then sparking off in tiny white clusters until, slowly, they disappeared entirely. But not before everyone had seen. Somewhere, Jaime Lannister began laughing hysterically. Through wheezes, he managed to stutter, "Fire, cannot, heart a dragon." "Fucking hell," muttered Thorne. "He's a fucking Targaryen." In the stillness of the shocked courtyard, no one moved or spoke beyond those two. Then Robb was at Jon's side, arms wrapped around him, and helping the other man keep upright as they moved quickly away from the barn. "Jon!" Robb cried, clutching at him tightly, Grey Wind dashing forward to hop and jump around the two men in excitement. Jon's hand shook as he reached for the other man. When his hand settled on his shoulder, Jon's hand clenched and he quickly drew Robb to him. Ignoring his own state of nakedness, tears washed some of the soot away from his face, mingling and making the ash run into gray streaks. "I don't care," Robb was muttering into Jon's hair. "I don't care. I don't..." Arya slammed her body hard into the two, making them stumble until Robb regained their equilibrium. Hermione swished her wand, conjured a robe for Jon, letting it hover awkwardly around him until Robb noticed and drew it around his brother. Sansa stood apart, her hands at her mouth and tears in her eyes as she walked to her siblings in slow, tentative steps. "Sansa," coughed Jon, eyes catching on her and holding out a hand invitingly. With a sob, the red-haired woman crossed the last meter or so, separating her from her family, and crashed into Jon, all the while breathlessly whispering apologies. "But what does this mean?" asked Hermione, glancing around at those who were staring open-mouthed at the Lord Commander, some with fear in their eyes. "Looks like those old rumors about Rhaegar stealing and raping Lyanna might be more than just stories," commented Jaime with an infuriating smirk on his face. "Because it looks like the prince had one more child that Robert didn't kill." His face twitched briefly into sorrow. "And Ned must have known," commented the Great John in shock, looking around at the other northern lords who were equally confused, "to have hidden Snow with him." "But," repeated Hermione, frustrating growing, "what does that mean?" "He's the last Targaryen," the woman with the spear who joined them said quietly, making eyes swing toward her, "the rightful heir to the Seven Kingdoms, King of Westeros." Jon made a strange noise. "He is born amidst salt and smoke," cried Melisandre, breaking into the conversation from where she stood, under a guard of no less than 4 wildlings. "He is Azor Ahai, the prince who was promised." She sank to her knees. A stunned Alistair Thorne followed her, staring at Jon incomprehensibly, as everything he knew about the world was suddenly proved wrong, and he was adrift, unsure of where he stood. By the Black Gate, Davos Seaworth and the Baratheon soldier Tarber followed suit. "No," Jon muttered. No, don't." Gred and Sam, looking unsure, shared a glance, but then also sank to their knees. Jon turned his head to stare at Robb, who drew away from him. "Robb, please. No, not you." Robb shook his head. "You will always be my brother," he said, instead, his voice low, full of promise. "Whether you're the king of Westeros, or Lord Commander, or this Azor Ahai, you're my brother." "And mine," chirped up Arya, staring at Jon. Sansa nodded. "And mine." She reached out and tentatively touched his shoulder. "My brother." "But you're the king in the north," protested Jon. "I won't take that." "You don't have to," replied Robb, just as quickly. "Not now, anyway." Jon stared at Robb for a long moment, his face unreadable, but then he nodded and agreed. "Not now." The king in the north turned partially to look at the courtyard, the confused and torn faces of his northern and Riverlands men, the scorn on the wildlings who would never kneel anyway, and those in supplication. Jon followed him, and at each of their sides, Arya and Sansa framed the two, one a king and the other a potential one. "We survived last night," began Robb, his voice carrying. "Barely, but we did." "Our true enemies are revealed," continued Jon in his Lord Commander voice. "The dead rise against us. They are our true enemy." "We fought a war in the south," added Robb, looking at his council and guards. "We managed a defeat, if not an uneasy peace, knowing that we might have to face Tywin Lannister again. And we will one day. But that is not the war we must now fight." Jon straightened his shoulders and tried to look as dignified as he could in a conjured robe that left his feet bare in the snow. "I know there were those who did not like the idea of the wildlings being let into the north to the other castles in need of repair, but we need people now to work together to beat back the dead." "My father had a saying," Sansa piped up, causing both Robb and Jon to turn to her in surprise and Arya's mouth to drop open. "The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." "We are a pack," shouted Robb. "We are not alone. We are one," added Jon, his voice carrying through the courtyard. "You either fight for the living, or you are the enemy of the living." His hard stare met each face, staring back at him. "Which are you? Are you pack, or enemy of the pact?" added Arya, her face cut as hard as granite, as the four Starks stared at those in the courtyard. Grey Wind threw his head back and howled, and Patrick Mallister added to it with a devil-may-care grin on his face. The other guards took up the cry. Then the Greyjohn was thrusting his sword in the air. Grin and Sam were back on their feet, their voices added to the clamor as more and more Northmen, Riverlanders, the Black Brothers, Seaworth, Tarber, Clegane, even Jaime Lannister and Brienne and the woman with the spear all raised their weapons or their voices, joining in until the words came together. "Pack! Pack!" A smile stretched across Hermione's face as she caught Robb's eyes. She reveled in the triumph in them, in the gleam, the anticipation of what was to come as he stood with four members of his family, only missing the last two. When the cries began to die down, Hermione meandered close enough to the siblings, and perhaps, she thought, one cousin, until Robb reached forward and caught her hand in his, drawing her to his side. "Do you still have that map?" he asked her, with Arya, Sansa, and Jon turning to her expectantly.
Hermione nodded.
"Good." The smile Robb gave her was not necessarily kind, but rather determined. "We wasted too much already. It's time to get our family back together." He looked around at them all. "We're missing Bran and Rickon and no more. We are a pack. We will face whatever comes, together." Far beyond the wall, in the northernmost reaches of the land of always winter, out of their immediate sight, the morning rays failed to pierce the dark horizon. There, growing in strength, was a violent blizzard of ice and snow, slowly making its way south. An icy wind preceded it, sweeping across the land and hitting the wall with the force of a gale, making the giant structure groan. As one, the four Starks and Hermione turned to face the wall. The giant structure was imposing and foreboding from the angle they were at, but it was all that stood between them and the immediate threat of the Whites and their masters. "Together," murmured Hermione, squeezing Robb's hand. He glanced at her, and they smiled. "Together," he added, and the words were a promise